Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Mrs. Fishbaugh.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The chair will entertain up to 15 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The committee will come to order. I'm glad we did the
to better support
the pledge. So
and their children.
we're going to maybe have to do that every time.
One of the unique challenges military during weekend drill. With the 110th Wing's efforts to support families led to the establishment of the 2nd Air National Guard Child Care Facility Program. Partnering with the Augusta Child Development Center, the program provides child care for over 20 children of military members during regular and rescheduled
Check. Test.
All right, I think it's working now. Let's get going. Thank you, Secretary Yellen, for appearing before this committee. I understand that it was 30 years ago this week that you were first nominated to a public sector role as a member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. It's a noteworthy record of service. I congratulate you, and I appreciate your willingness to answer our members' questions today. You've joined the recent chorus of economists who acknowledged that it was a mistake to call inflation, quote, transitory. But it's worth noting the fundamental mistake: President Biden's reckless tax and spend policies that have sent the cost of living skyrocketing almost 20% since he took office. Families pay more today for pretty much everything than the day Joe Biden was sworn into office. Real wages are almost 4% lower than when he became president. The Federal Reserve has hiked borrowing rates to try to control inflation. Mortgage payments for the median price new home are now nearly $1,200 higher per month. Prices at the store are up. The cost of a gallon of gas is roughly 50% higher today than when President Biden took office. These are the facts. This is the reality that American families are living in President Biden's economy. Instead of allowing families hit by these high prices to keep more of their hard-earned money, President Biden wants the highest tax increase on families and small businesses in American history. Last week, President Biden called for the Trump tax cuts to expire, promising, quote, "If I'm reelected, it's going to stay expired." So President Biden's plan is for the average family of four making $75,000 to pay an extra $1,500 to the IRS each year. President Biden's promise is that the child tax credit will be slashed in half. President Biden's promise is that small businesses will face a 43.4% tax rate. This will all happen when the Trump tax cuts all expire under his watch. Basic facts. President Biden's promise is that family farms will be forced to sell off to big corporations to pay the death tax. In his latest budget, President Biden continues breaking his promise to not raise taxes on families making less than $400,000. Under the president's plan, seniors will see more of their life savings captured by the federal government. Small businesses will be taxed on their sweat equity and face tax rates approaching 50%. Energy producers will pay more, weakening America's energy independence. Madam Secretary, your own department's data shows that millions of Americans earning less than $400,000 will end up paying a portion of your proposed business tax increases. That's on top of the new audits that will be coming from the IRS, which you conceded in this committee last year. Over 90% of those audits will fall on middle-class earners and small businesses. To add insult to injury, under one-party rule, Democrats spent billions of taxpayer dollars on welfare for the wealthy and well-connected. They gave the wealthy tax credits for leasing or buying luxury electric vehicles, while working families got higher prices from the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Under that same law, the Biden administration is sending billions of taxpayer dollars to Chinese companies tied to their communist government, all in the name of climate change. China is an adversarial nation spreading its influence around the world at the expense of American workers and producers. America should be standing up to China's unfair practices, not using tax dollars to make us even more dependent on China. The record of the 2017 Trump tax cuts could not be more different than the policies of this administration. The Congressional Budget Office found that after the law went into effect, the share of taxes paid by the top 1% of households increased, while the burden falling on lower income earners decreased. Real median household income increased by $5,000, a bigger gain than the prior 8 years combined. The officially reported poverty rate dropped to its lowest level in U.S. history, and Black and Hispanic unemployment reached historic lows. We reversed the decades-long trend of American companies picking up and moving their jobs, factories, and money overseas. Beyond our borders, the Biden administration has adopted a posture of surrender and retreat. The OECD Global Tax Deal, the administration is trying to negotiate would surrender America's tax revenue and jobs to foreign countries. Congress writes the laws, not bureaucrats negotiating behind closed doors. This deal has no path forward in this Congress. I hope today we can get some answers on why President Biden insists on tax hikes for working families, while the wealthy and well-connected receive cash handouts for their Green New Deal spending. Thank you for appearing today, and I look forward to our testimony. I now recognize the Ranking Member Neal for his opening statement.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, we're honored to have you in our presence today. We also want to highlight what has been a remarkable career. Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and a successor to Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. We're honored by your presence. Your team has been hard at work electrifying our nation, ushering in a new era at the IRS, and implementing Joe Biden's record-breaking economic agenda, all with the American people at the center of the work. Even the Wall Street Journal recently noted that our economy is the envy of the world. It's a well-deserved recognition for an administration that has created 15 million jobs, spurred a small business boom, and rebuilt an economy from the bottom up, the middle out, and breaking record after record. 4 years ago, this success was unimaginable, and it certainly was never guaranteed. Millions were without a job at no fault of their own. The grocery shelves were bare, and we had no answers for the mysterious virus taking the country by storm. And then President Joe Biden took office, returning our nation to one of science, sensibility, and for sure, stability. Starting with the American Rescue Plan and most recently with the Inflation Reduction Act, which came from this committee, Democrats' legislative successes have helped to transform the nation. We are bringing down health care and household energy costs. The clean energy economy has created over 270,000 jobs, and everywhere you travel, you can tell that infrastructure projects are underway across the country. Thanks to our multi-year investment, the Internal Revenue Service has had another outstanding filing season. I'm pleased with how in such a short order, the agency has stood up in a secure way to file tax forms. I know many folks in the Commonwealth were able to use this program to ease their filing experience this year, including a state senator who mentioned it to me yesterday. And after years of underfunding at the hands of our Republican colleagues through their budget cuts, returns are being processed faster, more Americans are getting the service they deserve, and already $500 million in taxes owed from very wealthy people have been recovered. Looking ahead, the President's budget supercharges this progress and will finish the job for our people. The President's budget ensures that they have the supports necessary to not only fully participate in our workforce, but also to raise families and care for loved ones as we witness wages going up, and the responsibility that we have to hold the well-connected accountable. Amid all of this success, our colleagues on the other side have had difficulties trying to use their gavels for the work of the American people. The amount of time that has been wasted in this Congress on chaos, conspiracies, impeachments, and we have been fielding questions about this expiration of their tax scam for next year. There are still over 8 months left in this Congress and many more until these provisions expire, but it seems as though legislative opportunity is well already being considered by the Congress. I've seen their former leader calling for the devaluation of the dollar, stunting, and even in some cases repealing much of our legislative progress in the name of politics. It is deeply unpopular, and it puts the health of our economy and countless paychecks on the line. While we expand what's possible and build the economy of the future, our colleagues plot the next round of trickle-down economics with another round of tax cuts for the wealthy. I didn't ever believe that advisors to the former president would be suggesting that we manipulate our currency or we subtract from the independence of the Federal Reserve Board that is now has a chairman who is a Republican. This is unheard of, that these sorts of our economy would be jousted with in the coming months. I've said it before, and let me say it once more. The majority is a threat to the health and economic security of our American people. Time to get past the chaos, time to get past the conspiracies, and get on with our work. We look forward to hearing you as you set the record straight, and pleased that you are joining us again. Let me yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Neal. Today's sole witness is United States Secretary of the Treasury, Ms. Janet Yellen. The committee has received your written testimony, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. Secretary Yellen, you may begin when you are ready.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to testify. The Biden administration has driven an historic economic recovery over the past 3 years. GDP growth has been strong, growing 3% over the past 4 quarters. Inflation has decreased significantly since its peak, though we have more work to do. The labor market is also remarkably healthy, with the unemployment rate below 4% for the longest stretch in over 50 years. Real wages and household median wealth have increased since before the pandemic, and families are putting their additional income and accumulated savings back into the economy. Consumer sentiment is up 21% from 1 year ago. President Biden and I are taking additional actions to bring down the costs of key household expenses like energy, prescription drugs, and housing. We're also focused on expanding our economy's capacity to create good jobs while reducing the deficit. As we implement the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, we're creating economic opportunity for Americans across the country, including those without college degrees and in communities that had historically been overlooked or left behind. Companies have announced over $675 billion in clean energy and manufacturing investments since the start of this administration, some of which I've gotten the opportunity to see firsthand. The modernization of the Internal Revenue Service, made possible by the IRA and discretionary appropriations, has enabled us to combat tax evasion by the wealthiest Americans that costs our country over $150 billion a year. And it's made it easier for taxpayers to file their taxes and get the credits they're owed. We met or exceeded all the goals we set out for this filing season, including reaching an 88% level of service, saving taxpayers over 1.4 million hours of hold time, and providing an additional 11,000 hours of in-person assistance compared to last year. We also successfully launched the Direct File pilot program, an easy, free, and secure way to file taxes on a computer or mobile device with over 140,000 accepted returns in the first year. The President's budget proposes additional investments to lower costs for workers and families and strengthen our economy while reducing the deficit, including making permanent the expansion of tax credits for health insurance premiums enacted in the American Rescue Plan and extended in the IRA, and expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit, Child Tax Credit, and Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. These proposals would help make health care more affordable, reduce child poverty, and give working families more breathing room in their household budgets. We can make these investments while reducing the deficit by $3 trillion over a decade through a combination of smart savings and tax proposals. President Biden and I have proposed implementing a billionaire minimum tax so that the top 1/100% pay their fair share, raising the tax on corporate stock buybacks to encourage businesses to reinvest profits in their workers and grow their companies, and closing estate and gift tax loopholes that allow wealthy Americans to pay less than they would otherwise owe. As a whole, the President's budget will enable us to address costs that families face right now and to bolster our country's economic strength for the years ahead. I'll now be happy to take your questions.
Thank you. We'll now proceed to the question and answer session. Madam Secretary, in all four of President Biden's budgets, he plans to hit middle-class families with a multi-trillion-dollar tax increase starting in 2026. He has promised to let the Trump tax cuts expire. Isn't it true that President Biden is promising a $1,500 tax hike on a family of four earning less than $75,000 by that action?
The President has been very clear that no family earning less than $400,000 will face a tax hike. He's not proposed such a thing since he took office, and he's not proposing to allow that to happen when parts of TCJA expire.
So when you testified at the Finance Committee last month, you said, quote, "The President does not have a plan to address the coming tax hikes." That was at the Senate Finance Committee last month. Isn't it true that without a plan, the President would slash the child tax credit in half, which means parents lose $1,000 from their pocketbooks for each child each year.
The president has principles that will guide his negotiations with Congress over how to handle this, and his principles has made clear that he opposes increasing taxes on people earning less than $400,000. He supports cutting taxes for working people and families with children to give them more breathing room.
Madam Secretary, does that mean that he will support the child tax credit to be made permanent at $2,000 that was put in the Trump tax cuts? Would the president support that? Because that affects working families.
The president has proposed in his most recent budget expanding the child tax credit and has supported the Wyden-Smith legislation that would increase the child tax credit now as well.
Would you say that that it would be true that leaving the Trump tax cuts expired means President Biden would roll back Republicans' guaranteed deduction, resulting in a tax increase of $3,373 for a family earning less than $75,000?
What I said, what the president has clearly articulated, is that no family earning under $400,000 will see their taxes go up in any set of proposals that the president is willing to.
So I appreciate that. We have looked at every budget that has been presented, and you have called for the expiration of the 2017 tax cuts, but there is no plan, as you testified before the Senate Finance Committee, saying that the president has no plan in regards to how to make sure there's no tax increases less than $400,000. I would love and welcome, and I think the American people would welcome, a plan from the president. In fact, he loves to interject in all kinds of policies. I would think he would want to there. In testimony before the committee, former Senator Phil Gramm called the Biden administration's decision to cut out Congress and unilaterally negotiate a tax deal with bureaucrats in Europe, quote, the greatest abuse of the Constitution of the United States, close quote, was Senator Phil Gramm's comment when he testified here. Each of the Biden administration's failures at the OECD can be traced to its decision to act unilaterally and without Congress. Will you commit to reject any OECD profit reallocation plan that disproportionately impacts American companies or allow U.S. tax revenues to be stolen away by foreign governments?
Well, let me say that the administration, the Biden administration, has worked very closely with Congress to inform and get input on Congress's priorities to guide these negotiations over the last 3.5 years, and will continue to do that. And I strongly believe that the Pillar 2 agreement that's been reached is very much in support of goals that are good for this country. The United States has been the only country until this agreement was signed to impose a tax on the overseas profits of its multinationals. And what this agreement secured is that all countries now will tax the profits of their multinational companies, which creates a level playing field for American companies and will stop the race to the bottom. And the United States will benefit by adopting the minimum tax that's consistent with.
So, Secretary Yellen, the communication from the very first time we ever had a conversation, I raised the issue, for example, of the research and development tax credit not being accounted for during OECD, but direct government subsidies of the Chinese Communist Party gets much more credit than our research and development tax credit. You said that you've worked with Congress. We've been raising that from day one. We've been providing how detrimental that would be to U.S. companies by empowering the Chinese, which you have visited that country several times in your tenure, which has empowered them, but you've done nothing in regards to that.
I'm sorry, but we have.
What have you done?
We are negotiating with other countries right now to try to get favorable treatment for the R&D tax credit, and I'm hopeful that these negotiations will be successful. And I would point out that other tax credits, including the green tax credits and credits affecting the low-income housing tax credit, have been codified as continuing under Pillar 2.
So I'll just reiterate again our concern with almost $200 billion leaving American companies and going to foreign nations under the plan that this administration negotiated with Europeans, that we are adamantly opposed to that. The Democrats' so-called Inflation Reduction Act that was supposed to prevent electric vehicle tax credits from going to foreign entities of concern in China and adversarial nations, but Treasury has created multiple loopholes that will send American taxpayer dollars to Chinese billionaires and Chinese manufacturers. Isn't it true that the foreign entity of concern rules written by your Treasury Department are more China favorable than the same foreign entity of concern standards from Biden's Commerce Department for semiconductors?
I believe that they're similar. These are very strong restrictions that, beginning this year and then continuing next year, preclude companies from receiving the $7,500 credit if this year they contain battery components that are have originated in a foreign entity of concern. And next year it will affect critical minerals and processing. We've worked very closely with the Department of Energy and the Department of Commerce. It has been an interagency work to formulate these FIAC rules in a way that will certainly restrict China from profiting from the tax credit.
I think it's pretty clear that Treasury's version of these rules would allow Chinese billionaires to receive hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars, as confirmed by the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation. So in response to this committee, we recently passed the End Chinese Dominance of Electric Vehicles in America Act, led by Congresswoman Carol Miller, which would close those egregious loopholes and protect the American taxpayer. Treasury must do a better job of pushing back against our foreign adversaries. I now recognize the ranking member for questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Great job on China. You were firm, you were very strong, very assertive. IRA has worked. How about the harmonization of international tax rates so people don't seek the lowest tax jurisdiction, even though that's not where profits have been earned? Good work on the CHIPS Act. Really good work on the infrastructure bill. Certainly the American Rescue Package. This is a great story for us to tell. So I'm going to give you some time to talk, Madam Secretary. Implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act is really important. Let me give you a couple of minutes to talk about that.
Well, let me just start by saying that although there's still more work to do, we've made tremendous progress implementing it. We've completed more than 60 guidance projects, and these are all on critical and complex issues, and we've been focused on getting the issues right. This involves collaboration with the Department of Energy, with EPA, and other experts to make sure that we're implementing the law effectively and as intended. It's also tremendously important, the impact that the IRA clean energy credits are having. We can see that they're catalyzing hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in cutting-edge clean energy technology and strengthening our supply chains and at the same time lowering emissions in line with our climate goals and creating good jobs across the country, and particularly in parts of the country that really have not seen a lot of burst of economic activity. Treasury has been doing research on the impact of the Act, and what we find is that investment is especially strong in communities that have not seen a lot of investment, that have lower income and a smaller fraction of college-educated workers. So this is making a huge difference. The response has been enormous, and I've had the privilege of seeing many of the projects that are being spurred, as well as training that's taking place. I've had the privilege of visiting many workforce training programs that have been started to give our workers the skills to fill the good high-wage jobs that are being created by this IRA.
Thanks. And could you speak to labor participation rates?
Yes, labor force participation rates actually have moved up substantially. For adult workers, male and female, they've now exceeded the where they were pre-pandemic. They're moved up a great deal, and overall have moved up as well. And there is a downward trend that we see in labor force participation due to demographics, but this is really offsetting that. And this means not only more people working, and also in response to higher real or inflation-adjusted wages, it also alleviates supply constraints, and it's one of the factors that's enabled our economy to grow last year, for example, at 3%, and to create more than 200,000 jobs a month on a consistent basis.
9 million jobs every day in America go unanswered, as we know, and that's part of the skills alignment that you've just spoken to. A better job for all of us is required, perhaps through community colleges. But just as I close out, and I thank you for your testimony, I also want to point out something else. Everybody on this committee during my time objected to Chinese efforts to manipulate currency. So hearing now that the former administration is talking about the idea that they might manipulate currency, they might threaten the independence of the Federal Reserve Board. I never thought the day would come when it would be Democrats standing up for the independence of the Federal Reserve Board before our Republican colleagues. And consistently, both parties stood up against Chinese currency manipulation, and you were a very remarkable part of that. So we thank you for your testimony. Delighted you're here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I now recognize the Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Buchanan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here. We appreciate your service. A lot of us have had an opportunity to work with you over the years. I want to touch on two things and have a little bit of a conversation. IMF came out a couple of days ago with a report. They're very concerned about where we're at financially. My background before I got here, 30 years in business, a lot of entities, basically hundreds and hundreds of balance sheets and income statements. I'm very concerned as well, because at some point, 49 out of 50 governors have to balance the budget. You can't continue down this road. Now, they're concerned because our deficit this year went from 1.4 trillion last year to 1.7. Interest on the debt, as you know, is close to $1 trillion. I've been here long enough, not quite 20 years, but been here long enough to clearly know that in the last 20 years, it's over $20 trillion in debt. Now, there's a lot of finger pointing going on, but we need to find a way to work together. It's got to be dealt with at some point. I know you've laid something out, but I've heard these stories, not so much from you, but others, about pretty pictures down the road. But I look around the room here, and I have 10 grandkids, and I look around the room, there's a lot of kids in here under 30, and we're spending their money, and we got to get very real about it. If you're in the state of Florida, one thing they have to do is pass a balanced budget amendment That's the only thing they have to do, but they have to do that. And by the way, 49 out of 50 governors have to do the same thing. So I guess I ask you, what's your feeling about the IMF and their report a couple of days ago where they're very concerned about where we're at financially and where we're going?
Well, I would say I'm not terribly concerned about where we are, but I do have concern about where we're going unless we undertake some significant steps to reduce the budget deficit. And if you look at the president's 2025 budget, you'll see that he's proposed $3 trillion in measures to reduce the deficit over the next decade. I think that's important.
Let me ask
and
you, Madam
what it does is it keeps a key metric of the burden of the debt, which is real net interest that we have to pay on the
I'm
debt.
limited on my time. I want to get to this other question. You talked about nobody paying any taxes above 400. I was chairman of the Florida Chamber, 130,000 businesses in the chamber, and I'd say 95% were pass-through entities. You're talking about letting that sunset, so what that means, so you understand, if someone's got 200-300 employees or 50 employees, you could very well be at 53%, 54% taxes all in. Because the pass-through rate would go back to 39.6, there's a 3.2, and then if you look at states, I hate to say it, California and New York and some of the other states, the great states, but they have another 10-15% tax on top of it. So pass-through entities could very well, and then you're looking to get rid of 199A, could very well be north of 50%. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, the president is committed to ensuring that no family, including those with pass-through businesses making under $400,000, would see their tax increase. But he does believe, for the sake of tax fairness, that it is appropriate for wealthy individuals and corporations to pay more.
I've been in the real world in terms of building businesses and everything else. You might have 60, 80, 90 employees, you make 600, but then you got to give up half of it or a good portion of it. Just 400 is nothing if you're trying to build a business small and large. I'm not talking about large corporations, I'm talking about small business, and it'll be a huge burden on these entities, from that standpoint. So I'm just telling you, if I look across Florida, a lot of these small, medium-sized businesses, yeah, they do make 600, but they don't take home 600. They take home 100, 150, 200. They leave the capital in there to grow and build their business. That's the reality about where that's at. What's your thoughts?
Well, as I said, I think the president feels it is important to tax those who are earning very high incomes at higher rates.
One big thing is 199A. Where are you at on that in terms of whether you're going to let that sunset? 199A is at 20% for pass-through entity.
I'm not sure. I need to get back to you on that.
Yeah, well, let me know because that's very critically important. We went for corporate rates 35 to 21, but you can't have pass-through rates at 40%. It makes no sense because everybody's going to move to a C Corp. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Doggett is recognized.
Thank you so much for your testimony today about a budget that demonstrates that we can put our country on sound financial footing, reduce our deficit, and make some new investments so long as we demand that the well-connected and large corporations pay their fair share and that we begin to close some of the loopholes in a tax code that's so full of holes it looks like Swiss cheese. In contrast, what the chairman has been urging the Biden administration to do is to embrace an extension of all of the very inequitable Trump tax breaks that I've seen estimates would cost $3.5 trillion in additional debt. At the same time that they express all this concern about the debt, they seem to be about building more of that debt. I appreciate the fact that the president and you certainly understand the ramifications of that. They also spend a lot of time defending corporations that like to hide their profits on American sales in foreign tax havens. And I appreciate the leadership that you have shown the world at OECD and elsewhere to stop this race to the bottom. why is it important that the United States implement fully the agreement that the European countries are already implementing to stop this global race to the bottom in corporate taxation?
Well, thank you. I believe that this race to the bottom in corporate tax rates took place over decades around the world. One jurisdiction competing with others to attract investment, and the only beneficiaries from that were really the companies themselves. Workers in all the countries where this was taking place ended up bearing more of the tax burden, and countries found it increasingly difficult to tax corporations to raise the funding that we need to support middle-class families and to invest in our country. And so stopping the race to the bottom means multinationals based in every country around the world will all face the same minimum tax. Some countries will charge more than the minimum tax. We've proposed, I believe that the United States can, given the environment for business in our country, we can afford to do that, and we've proposed a minimum rate of 21%. Also, that would be in line with our proposal for the corporate alternative minimum tax.
As you know, some of the Republicans that really don't believe in taxing corporations at all have said, well, if you go above 15%, which they don't support either, and you go to a higher level, that this will reduce American competitiveness. How is it that our corporations, our multinationals, would remain competitive if they pay a rate that on their foreign profits that's higher than 15%?
Well, competitiveness really has to do with differentials in incentives across countries. And prior to Pillar 2, the United States was the only country that taxed the overseas earnings of its multinationals. We have the GILTI tax. It's a lower tax rate, and it's not country by country, but our companies did just fine with that. The rest of the world had nothing. Now the rest of the world will go to a country by country 15% minimum, which would leave the United States with the lowest rate, and we can, even if we go up to 21%, the differential is substantially smaller than it was before.
Thank you. I've also heard increasing concern that we place our cleaner domestic production on a more even playing field. The fact that we are importing steel and aluminum and some other products that are made in a very dirty environment abroad. What do you think should be done about trying to see that American companies are competitive or not being subject to anti-competitive practices with this dirty production?
Well, President Biden proposed, I believe last week or the week before, to actually raise tariffs on Chinese steel. Our firms are cleaner, and China in steel suffers from tremendous overcapacity, which leads it to really sell at unfairly low prices globally, and I think it's appropriate to do that.
Thank you for your leadership.
Mr. Kelly is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary, thank you for being here again and for spending so much of your life in working in this body to try and make policy that actually makes sense. That's why I still keep trying to figure out Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, the possible loss for us of almost $200 billion. What's the offset for that? So how do we replace that lost revenue? How does that work into the whole idea of this?
Well, that revenue estimate you're referring to JCT, I believe, and that is an extreme negative case. They indicated in their analysis that the outcome overall is uncertain, and in the most likely cases, the outcome in terms of tax collections would be positive, not negative.
Well, I know that's all debatable, and I keep wondering why in the world the United States is so hell-bent on giving up market to foreign countries and saying that this isn't the best interest globally of what we want to do. I'm more interested in a very strong United States that remains the strongest country on the face of the earth, that we don't have to depend on anybody else. Now, I understand that the U.S. is going to be presented an agreement on Pillar 1 to sign in the next 2 months. So is Treasury committed to work with Congress before signing the OECD Pillar 1 agreement?
We've been in touch with Congress throughout this process. One of the things we heard from Congress on Pillar 1 is that there needed to be an opportunity for public comment. We heard that certainty around what's called Amount B that has to do with transfer pricing is very important to members of Congress, and it's something where we need to make sure we get firm commitments from other countries. We also heard from Congress that getting a very clear definition of digital service taxes, what they are and what is ruled out, all this is very important, and we agree, and those are our red lines, and it's what we're negotiating for in the final months of negotiations on Pillar 1.
And I agree with you on everything you've said, that on its best day, this whole scenario, what we're going through can be considered unbelievably complicated, and how at the end of the day it is in the best interest of the United States. I've always thought that, we seem to be getting into a push and pull on what constitutional authority lies with which body, and the idea that somehow Congress will be the afterthought in a process that absolutely it is supposed to control. So I'm really interested, as you go forward on this, the sharing of all that information. I just don't understand the negotiations in a constitutional authority, and I know you can do certain things, and there's other things that you have to run through the Congress. My concern is that the Congress seems to be an afterthought now, and not the main consideration when we do these negotiations. And it's like, well, this is what you gave us some authority to do, so we're going to head and do it. I just don't understand at all how we sell this to the people we represent, that somehow this is in the best interest of the United States. I still want to dwell on the fact that we have been losing market share because of policies that we've initiated, not so much that we have strong foreign competition, as that we have weak policy when it comes to maintaining our own market share. And for whatever reason, we seem to have become a global entity as opposed to the strongest country the world has ever known, and a nation that is the first responder in everything that goes bad in the world. We're the first ones to be there, and we can keep seeding off all of these different things that we have, all of these different abilities that we have. And so, no, I think it's more important to act globally right now. I would just suggest that I'm looking at the globe right now, and the globe is looking at us to see, I wonder when the Yanks are going to show up. I just hate to see us keep giving up authority, and the negotiations taking place from the executive branch and then being run through the Congress at a later date. So all I'm asking you to do is commit. Like, we need to know what's going on and what's taking place. I don't like giving anybody a pen to go ahead and sign on to something in an international trade and a global tax initiative. It just doesn't make sense to me, and I think it's totally unconstitutional. And in fact, it's just not the right way to do things.
We have consulted with Congress throughout over the last 3.5 years.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate what you're saying.
Would need to be.
It depends how, Ms. Yellen, excuse me, just to reclaim my time's up, but it depends on how you identify we've consulted with Congress. I like to be consulted before something happens, not afterwards. It happens that you guys are willing to sign on. Well, thank you for your service to the country. I think it's been incredible, and thank you for being with us today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Yellen, for being here today. But more important, for your tremendous leadership and your steady-handedness in your position, not only now but over the years. I'd like to start by noting a couple of data points, a few data points. 15 million jobs have been created under President Biden. More Americans have health insurance than ever before. Democrats expanded child tax credit, cut child poverty by over 40% and benefited over 35 million families. The IRS is holding wealthy tax cheats accountable and has already recovered over $500 million in taxes owed. Wages are outpacing inflation, and our economy is outperforming the rest of the advanced countries around the world. And Madam Secretary, you are in large part responsible for those successes, so thank you very much. And I'd like to start with a couple of things that you mentioned in your testimony. First is the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. As you mentioned, there were a host of provisions in that bill designed to create jobs, boost renewable energy, and lower cost for consumers. Can you talk a little bit more about the implementation of the clean energy tax credits in that act? And are those incentives working? And what sort of investment are you seeing in renewable energy, manufacturing jobs, etc.?
Thank you. First, thank you for your kind words. So we're working around the clock to write the regulations that will provide certainty to households and businesses around the credits. We are seeing the IRA clean energy credits catalyze investment in clean energy technologies. We're concerned about our supply chains, particularly being over-reliant on China for many aspects of our clean energy, whether it's solar panels or batteries. We want to make sure that we're strengthening our supply chain. At the same time, we're creating good jobs and lowering emissions. And we're seeing many good jobs, and the wage and apprentice requirements to receive that large bonus really ensure that the jobs that are being created are good jobs. We're seeing investments in many parts of the country, especially places that are in need, whether they're areas of the country that were dependent on fossil fuels and have seen coal mines or plants close, areas that just haven't benefited from very much investment. We're especially seeing good results there. And we're making sure that people know who can benefit from this law. It has unique features that nonprofits and state and local governments can actually benefit from this law through the direct pay feature. We're working hard to make sure that potential beneficiaries understand how this can positively affect them.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to ask about 2025 and the upcoming expiration of the 2017 Republican tax bill. I appreciate the President reiterating that no one making under $400,000 a year will see a tax increase. One of the things that's been left out by my friends on the other side of the aisle in talking about this is that it wasn't paid for. Their bill was not paid for, and that by definition is inflationary. So in your view, what are some of the more responsible ways that we might offset the costs of any of the TCJA extensions?
Well, the President has proposed a very large number of raisers in his budget, and all of them could be used for this purpose. He's proposed raising the stock buyback tax, raising the corporate alternative minimum tax, enacting Pillar 2, which would bring in substantial revenues, raising, we would propose to raise the corporate income tax to 28%, still a cut relative to pre-TCJA, but substantial revenues, a billionaire's tax that would ask those extremely high-income individuals, wealthy individuals, to pay something more in line with what nurses and firefighters pay in their taxes. And there are a wealth of ideas there on how we can finance.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I yield back.
Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, first in this discussion conversation, my basic principle is at the scale we must borrow at, we want stability. We want liquidity. You know, we don't need any hiccups out there. And if some of this is a little off, you can pass me off to staff. But first I want to touch on cash balances. And part of this is there's a couple of reports out there that basically say statutory mechanics, when the current authority for borrowing starts to run out, we should be doing an operating cash balance of around $23 billion. That seems dramatically too low. In previous years, you would run, the Treasury would, like in 2023, $600 billion cash balance.
That's right.
Today, you're running over $900 billion. This is actually more of a mechanical, technical question. Do you need us, as the Ways and Means Committee, to update any statutory authorities or mechanics of what type of operating balance do you need to maximize stability? You saw the blip we had yesterday when you did your refunding announcements, and that was only what, a $41 billion tick up for that quarter. What do we do to maximize interest rate efficiency? Do you need any additional authority?
I don't think we need legislation. We have standing policy on operating cash balances, and I believe around $500 billion would be a normal level given the volume.
But you've been running
of our
dramatically
payments.
higher than that traditional $500-600 billion.
Well,
I think in the previous quarter you were running in the mid 800s. Now you're running over 900.
I think it depends on what our flow of expenses are, can vary over time, and of course it has ups and downs as we, tax collections are bunched around April 15th. But what caused our cash balances to run to exceptionally low levels in the past was the failure of Congress to raise the debt limit.
Well, but where I was going with that is there's an analysis that the statutory authority actually requires you to go down to $23 billion. And then that may be one of your legal team saying, okay, you have the authority to ignore that interpretation of the statute. So look, this is not a gotcha question. This is, I want to know what we can do to help maximize stability.
I'd be glad to get back to you with details on that, but I would say during my time, the major threat I've seen to our cash balance is that when Congress fails to raise the debt ceiling in a timely way, we have absolutely no alternative but to run down our cash balances. Otherwise, we would be unable to pay our bills.
Understood. I have a whole chart on your extraordinary measures and what's in your balances. I was just sitting here playing and I have much smarter people on staff. Like your billionaire tax. Okay, great politics. Do I read it properly in your testimony? It's a 0.01%. Okay, fine. But that works out to, over the next 10 years, on an average of 0.143% of GDP. This year, our burn rate is close to 9.6% of GDP. My fear is the politics of theatrics and the actual math. We do a crappy job telling each other the truth and telling the public the truth of the fiscal, because you gave some brilliant speeches when you were Federal Reserve Chairwoman on this type of debt future, and we're hitting numbers that we weren't supposed to hit for 10 years. When we did a quick analysis of some of the president's tax proposals, we were coming up, when we did the economic effects, of about 0.5, 0.6% of GDP. Okay, but if we're burning over 9% of GDP in borrowing, and this is in the time this year where tax receipts are up, what, 7%?
I'm not sure just how much they're up.
My fear is, as a committee, and we're not telling each other the truth of the scale of the borrowing stress. We're basically, the United States and China, we're consuming much of the world's available capital. Really wish we could have a more adult conversation of the scale of, this is almost hitting a dystopian levels of numbers. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Secretary, welcome to the committee. I want to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Neal and saluting, I think, what every member on this committee knows, your remarkable and incredible tenure of service to this great nation of ours. We're blessed to have you with us today. We are also blessed to have with us today another great woman who's in the audience with us today, Elsie Pasquale, and I think every member of the committee would join with me in recognizing that she gets a direct shot to heaven. Elsie, welcome here to the committee. Madam Secretary, I want to commend the Biden administration. I think Mr. Thompson went through the list of accomplishments, et cetera, but I especially want to focus on what you have repeatedly said, that the president, and he has been rock solid on this, has said that he's not going to raise taxes on anybody who's making under $400,000. And he's also been out there as a champion of both not only protecting but preserving Social Security. And again, and let's do the reality check here by saying that people making over $400,000 ought to be paying what people making $35,000, $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 are paying. And currently, because I think this comes as a surprise to most Americans, most earning above that level pay little or nothing. Millionaires end up contributing to Social Security in February. Bazillionaires and wealthy people pay little at all, or they circumvent the tax code altogether and don't pay into the nation's #1 anti-poverty program for the elderly and the #1 anti-poverty program for children. I commend President Biden for not only saying that we want to protect Social Security, but we want to expand its benefits, and we can do so by having all Americans pay their fair share. He couldn't have been clearer in his State of the Union message that this is what it's about. Of course, as you know, Madam Secretary, it's Congress that has to make these moves, and Congress hasn't done anything to enhance Social Security in more than 50 years. And talk about numbers, with 10,000 baby boomers a day becoming eligible for Social Security, it's long overdue that Congress take action. I applaud the president for doing so in such a straightforward, dramatic way and paying for it. So my brief question to you, Madam Secretary, could you discuss the importance of Social Security and why the president has adhered to making sure that we're not taxing people below $400,000?
Happy to. Every year, Social Security lifts tens of millions of seniors out of poverty. It is the federal government's most important anti-poverty program, and it's a guarantee that generations of Americans have counted on, namely after working hard throughout one's life, that you'll be able to retire with security and with dignity. And for those reasons, President Biden feels very strongly that we need to preserve the benefits and even extend the benefits of Social Security and honor the commitments that we have made to the nation's seniors. He's committed to working with Congress to protect Social Security for this generation and future generations.
I thank you, Madam Secretary, and I yield back.
Dr. Winster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being with us today, Secretary Yellen. Appreciate it. Much of our conversation today has been focused on the future of our nation's tax code, of course, as we approach the expiration of many key policies from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act next year. You know, when I think about tax policy, I think about making America the best place in the world to do business, and for that matter, the best place to work. And right now, we're in a fierce global economic, political, and strategic competition. It's not the same as after World War II. Our adversaries like China want to dominate the world markets, and they're doing that. And they want to make America and our allies dependent on key industries and supply chains. I know you know that. Keeping our tax code globally competitive is a crucial part of strengthening our domestic manufacturing base and reducing our dependence on unreliable supply chains, or those that can be used as weapons if so desired by our adversaries. Secretary, I know you've spoken at length about the need for de-risking. I agree with you on that. When it comes to our economic relationship with China and your desire to see more friendshoring of our critical supply chains. I also know you recently visited China, thank you for doing that, to discuss economic issues, including the massive subsidy-driven industrial overcapacity that China has built, which is distorting global markets. I'm not sure that we can always change what they do and their practices, but we can and should see what we can do to counter that. And I'm glad you focused on the risks of China than what they pose to our security, but I'm concerned that the administration's tax policy proposals would take us in exactly the wrong direction when it comes to our economic security and our national security, for that matter. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was a huge step towards making our tax code globally competitive, bringing more business investment back to the United States. Since it passed, we've seen zero corporate inversions, and instead we've seen American businesses bringing back their overseas earnings to fuel investment and wage growth here in the States. So now more than ever, we need to be working together to build on that type of progress, not reverse it by imposing crippling tax hikes on American families and businesses. I believe that's exactly what will happen if we do not act to renew key provisions of the 2017 tax reform law when they expire next year. Meanwhile, the negotiators from your department representing us at the OECD are preparing to give away the U.S. tax base and allow foreign countries to impose discriminatory taxes on U.S. companies. This does not help us. Anyone who runs a business would understand that. I believe that tax increases proposed by the president's budget and the failed global tax negotiations being supported by this administration would severely harm our efforts to rebuild our domestic manufacturing and bring home critical supply chains. Secretary, the president's budget proposes increasing the corporate tax rate, so one of the highest in the world, even higher than communist China, which will make it much harder to bring manufacturing home from China. And to meet your desire to de-risk from the PRC. One example, the Chinese have a monopoly on generic medications, all the way down to the active pharmaceutical ingredients. How do we break that monopoly and reduce our health risk, our national security risk, by increasing corporate tax rates, making us unable to compete? I mean, are you against or are you for domestic supply chain production to enhance our national security and our national health security for our critical needs? Because I just don't see how increasing corporate tax rate, making us less competitive in the world, is going to bring business back to the United States where we need it most.
I certainly agree with the goal of having resilient supply chains. The idea of friendshoring means we'll work with trusted allies, and in addition to sourcing domestically. In the case of critical drugs, certainly I think that's an area where it's important that we have domestic capacity and are not totally reliant on China and other countries that may not prove dependable in the future. And there are a variety of ways to promote this.
Excuse me though, who are we going to depend on then? If we're increasing our corporate tax rate, that doesn't make us more competitive. And are we going to rely on our allies to reduce theirs? Is that the idea? I mean, this just makes no sense.
Well,
We've had no one leave.
I would point out that the Pillar 2 agreement does impose taxes on China that regardless of what their subsidies are or how they choose to tax, the United States and other countries that adopt Pillar 2 will have the ability to place taxes up to this minimum tax on China to try to level the playing field. So China will not gain any advantage if it chooses. It has said it will implement the deal. But if it doesn't do so, we will implement the deal on Chinese multinationals that compete with ours through a provision called the undertax payment rule.
Well, you had conversations with them. I would doubt that they said that they would cut their subsidies. I yield back.
Mr. Pascrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Madam Secretary. So, unemployment is at an historic low. Interrupt me when I say something that's not correct or can't be proven by data. Wages are rising. I want to come back to that in a minute. Inflation has plummeted. We got work to do. Factories are booming. America's economy is the envy of the entire world. There's no two ways about it. So I'm proud of our efforts to make big business and rich tax cheats finally pay their fair share. What the heck is wrong with that? And we've made progress. We have not made progress in the area of the income gap that still exists, even when wages increase 4 to 5%. We've got to do something about the code, the tax code, the very tax code. You can draw a straight line from these wins to the policies enacted by President Biden. And yes, Democrats. Secretary Yellen, I'm glad the budget includes, finally, closing the carried interest loophole. Maybe the worst loophole in the entire tax code. My Ending Wall Street Tax Giveaway Act mirrors your proposal to ensure Wall Street executives and private equity tycoons pay their fair share. We came very close to closing that loophole, if you remember, in the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'm not giving up. Because if we don't do that, we continue to send the wrong message to taxpayers. You talk about competition, that's what we need. Madam Secretary, as the Congress continues to consider future tax legislation, can you commit to making carried interest fairness a top priority?
Yes.
Question 2. Earlier this year, the GAO released a report. I requested that report on ways to crack down on wealthy tax cheats. It found that good enforcement returns $12 for every dollar spent. Remember that report. But identifying high dollar cheating is a big challenge. They got every trick and every lawyer in the trade. As rich tax cheats use sophisticated and brazen tactics to obscure their earnings. That's nothing new over the last 45 years. Madam Secretary, can you expand on plans to address gaps in the IRS hiring, training, and tech so that the agency has the tools to close the tax gap?
The IRS is doing exactly that using the funding provided in the Inflation Reduction Act. Its budget was so limited after decades of cutting its budget as the economy grew that enforcement and the ability to hire competent tax lawyers, accountants, data scientists, and the like, that audit rates fell to exceptionally low levels on wealthy individuals, complex partnerships, and large corporations. And with the infusion of funds that the IRS has received, in addition to and importantly improving consumer service dramatically, it is going after all of those tax cheats who are responsible for what's estimated as a $7 trillion tax gap over the next decade. And it's had an early success in going after 1,000 individuals making more than $1 million who owed back taxes. It's already collected $500 million, but there's much further to go, and that's where the enforcement dollars are going. No increase, as I've promised and as the commissioner has promised, on households or small businesses earning under $400,000. It's all going to the areas that you named.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Welcome to the neighborhood, and I yield back.
Dr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Secretary. Thank you for being here. I want to see if you can help me understand some math, if you don't mind. With OECD proposals, joint tax said that Pillar 2 is going to cost us $120 billion in tax revenue over a 10-year period, and OECD Pillar 1 would cost us $40 billion over 10 years. This is JCT. So this is, we have to use this. So you're looking at $160 billion, probably on the conservative side, of lost revenue coming into the Treasury because we're turning that revenue over to other countries. All right, if that is the case and we're going to lose that revenue, that's one thing. But I can just point to 2 Georgia companies that will tell you that their analysis of Pillar 1 will cost them combined about $1 billion in sales. Now, if a company is going to lose $1 billion in sales, that means they're going to start cutting back, which means that it's going to put my fellow Georgians out of work. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So again, according to JCT, between Pillars 1 and 2, about $160 billion in lost revenue. Now, just laying the groundwork there. You made mention that you were going to propose or work with the president and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to raise the corporate minimum tax, AMT, the corporate tax to 28%, implement a new billionaire tax. You had a laundry list of items, correct, that you believe we should be raising taxes on. Okay. So let me ask you something. If a company owes the Treasury $200 million in taxes, and you would like to collect those taxes to help with deficit or spending, correct? But then they can turn around and write off all of that by buying green energy tax credits. How much of that money then of that $200 million is going to come into the Treasury? If I can wipe out my tax liability by buying green energy tax credits, what good does that do in coming into the Treasury?
Well, if the firm is using the transferability feature to buy these tax credits, then another company that we want to benefit from those credits, the stimulus and incentive that they offer, but that lacks sufficient tax liability. This is a way in which we provide.
But we're giving a pass to. Analysis has shown that about 90% of these tax credits are going to go to companies with over $1 billion in revenue. And again, if you're looking to bring revenue into the Treasury to pay for whatever.
Look, it's really the same thing as essentially making the tax credits refundable, which would have been an alternative.
Why would we do that? Why would we give companies like Amazon and Walmart, these major corporations, refundable credits to go spend money in the green energy sector?
Because many of the companies that are responding to the IRA and building the clean energy economy we want to see are companies that lack sufficient tax liability to be able to benefit from these tax incentives.
Wait a minute. Madam Secretary, reclaim my time. If you're going to go down that road and you're going to say companies lack that tax liability, why are we doing it on green energy and not looking at pharmaceuticals, not looking at other technology? But bottom line, why wouldn't we just say to Amazon, okay, not to pick on them, but they are a highly profitable company. Why not just say you've got to pay your taxes, and then you go buy a fleet of battery powered vans if you want to. You are cutting revenues. You are giving a tax break to the very people that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are saying have to go. They want them to pay their fair share, but they're not going to pay their fair share because they're going to go down this. They're going to go down this green energy deal that absolutely undermines our competitiveness. It doesn't make sense. The math doesn't add up. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, Madam Secretary. Thank you for your work. Let me begin by offering my sincere appreciation to your staff who are helping my office with a number of very complex constituent issues. Your staff is top-notch, and for that I'm grateful. In addition, I thank Treasury for its effort to work collaboratively with states to identify the owners and beneficiaries of the $30 billion in unclaimed savings bonds. And I know that you cannot comment because the rule is not final, but I wanted to share concerns that Representative Estes and I and others on this committee have raised about the proposed rule. Given that most of these unclaimed bonds come from the middle of the last century, when African Americans and others were excluded from banks and often turned to Treasury bonds as a key investment, I suspect that a high percentage of unclaimed bondholders will be blacks and people of other minority group identities. Given these concerns and given the success of state treasurers at helping people find unclaimed property, I worry that the proposed rules would greatly limit the ability of states to help Americans get back their missing savings bonds. My hope is that the final rule will allow Treasury to work more collaboratively with states as we intended when we enacted the law. And finally, in my remaining time, I'd like to thank you for your hard work implementing the increased energy investment credit for solar power, especially in low-income communities, and ask if you could share any updates to this program.
Thank you very much. And on the savings bonds issue, appreciate your comments, and we'll make sure that they're adequately considered before final regs are finalized. And on the bonuses for low-income communities, we've worked hard to clarify the rules and make sure that there is that low-income communities, that's a special focus of the IRA, to make sure that they're able to benefit, especially from the credits for solar, wind, and other renewable energies. We're working to finalize a set of regulations on this, and there are also allocated credits for low-income communities that the Department of Energy is accepted applications and awarded funds.
I thank you very much, and let me just ask, are these proven to be effective in terms of job creation?
I think overall, the data that we've amassed shows that the green energy, the green credits, have been very effective at stimulating investment, resulting in job creation, and those jobs are disproportionately in lower income communities with lower college graduation rates, also in rural communities and in communities that have been dependent on fossil fuel and seen job loss there.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Chairman, you're back to balance of my time.
Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Yellen, for joining us today. As you know, last month, the inflation came in hotter than expected for the third month in a row, which is a hit to American families by itself, but it's not just a one-time impact. Inflation's cumulative, and hardworking Kansans have been suffering for 3 years now, as this chart behind me indicates. Since Joe Biden took office, inflation's up over 19%. Joint Economic Committee estimate that Kansans are paying an average of nearly $1,000 more per month for the same goods and services, the same food, the same clothes, the same gas, the same rent that they did in January of 2021. And since then, in total, the average Kansan household has spent $23,600 more due to inflation. At the same time, net income is down almost 4%. I know your boss and his administration like to point to rosier numbers, but the fact is, for everyday Americans, the chart behind me is the epitome of Bidenomics, and it's a complete failure. Several years ago, Secretary, you mentioned it and called inflation transitory. And since you said that, I think that's the wrong word, but I guess I'd like to ask you what you would call inflation now. What word would you use?
Well, inflation has come down considerably, and the consensus of thinking among economists is that it was largely due to supply shocks that are mitigating, and our inflation has been quite similar to that in other advanced countries around the world, which suggests it was due to supply shocks connected with the pandemic.
I think you'll have a difference of opinion in economists. I mean, we even had Democrat and Republican economists in 2021 talking about the extra spending that was coming, proposed by the administration, that was actually going to result in this inflation, and actually that's what we've seen. Well, I think most Americans would use phrases like crippling or painful or hindering the pursuit of the American dream. In fact, my constituents tell me about the challenges they face when they fill up their cars or buy their groceries or pay the rent or mortgage. And the numbers show the pain behind me that's still continuing to increase to this day. They're the results of Bidenomics and the policies that have been increased by the Democrats over the last 3 years.
I think Americans
I do
care.
also want to switch gears a little bit before I run out of time. You mentioned earlier that that in the discussion with Chairman Smith that President Biden was not going to increase taxes on people making less than $400,000. In fact, I have a tweet here from Joe Biden dated 1 week ago today in talking about the Trump tax cuts. And he said, this tax cut is going to expire. If I'm reelected, it's going to stay expired. I did some quick calculations, and basically what that means is that there's going to be a 25% increase in the tax rate on people that make less than $44,000. There's going to be an additional $14,000 tax increase on people making less than $95,000, and additional increases on others up until making the $400,000. So if this tweet is right, that came from President Biden, he is going to increase taxes on people making less than $400,000.
President Biden has repeatedly issued a set of principles that will guide his negotiations, and he has repeatedly said that he will not support increases on families making under $400,000. And I haven't looked at the tweet myself.
I really want to get to one other point before we run out of time. But I can send you this tweet if you'd like to see that later after the committee. But I do want to get and talk a little bit about OECD. I know it's been brought up before, particularly Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. I mean, I've stated several times in the hearing room that, in principle, Republicans and Democrats are in favor of eliminating the discriminatory digital services taxes and provide tax simplicity and consistency for businesses in the growing digital economy. However, despite the ongoing discussions, we're still seeing more and more countries like Canada enact DSTs, and the proliferation of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 has provided foreign countries the opportunity to raid our tax base. In fact, Pillar 2, as pointed out by the Joint Committee on Taxation, is going to cost the U.S. Treasury tax revenue. Pillar 2 itself, as pointed out by my colleague, Representative Ferguson, that is $120 billion. And earlier this year, JCT report on Pillar 1 note that the plurality of in-scope countries would be from the U.S., and likely that the U.S. Treasury would forego between $100 million and $4.4 billion per year in tax receipts. In fact, I recently heard from one Fortune 100 company that they'd be required to send between $100 and $500 million from the U.S. Treasury to countries like France and Germany and Japan. I think these policies that have been negotiated with OECD are dangerous for our U.S. tax base. We're already struggling to collect enough revenue, and I think we need to change course. I'm sorry I'm out of time. I'd like to talk more about this with you, but I'll yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Secretary. I'm over on this side. There we go. Fool me too. I'd like to just clarify with you for those listeners watching this today the impact of your budget on the debt. Can you tell me the current level of our debt? What's the current debt amount? It's about 34 trillion. Yeah. Which includes debt held by the or intergovernmental debt as well.
That's right.
And can you also tell me what the projected debt will be at the end of this budget period, at the end of 10 years?
So normally you look at debt held by the public.
Okay, we can use that number if you'd like.
Which is currently about 28 trillion.
Right.
And in 2034, under our budget, I believe it would be around 45 trillion.
Yeah.
But GDP also grows, and the ratio to GDP would be a few percentage points more
Well,
than it is now.
It'd be at 128%, and now it's at 97. That's more than a few points.
No, it would be at 105% in
Okay,
2034.
that's debt held by the public, but it'll be a significant increase in.
It's now about 100%, so.
Yeah, now 97 would be about, it'd be increasing. So it'd be a significant increase in the debt.
A small increase in the debt.
Yeah, a significant increase in the debt. I want to refer also to your report on the fiscal health that came out just a month or two ago of the country. And you show that given current financial policies, including that in your budget, within 75 years, we'll just continue to see that increasing and would be at 513% or some above 500% of GDP at the end of a 75-year period. You say in that report the current policy is not sustainable and the cost of delaying policy reform is significant, will make it much harder to implement changes that will affect that trajectory. Do you think that's a real threat to the country going forward?
Are you referring to the Social Security report there?
No, I'm referring to a report on the nation's fiscal health done by the U.S. Treasury, signed by you.
Okay, so we need to enact policies to make sure that the debt stays sustainable and we're on a fiscally sustainable path. And the president has proposed over $3 trillion of deficit reduction.
Let's talk about that. We've already established that the debt will increase significantly under this budget. So where do you get the $3 trillion in savings? Where does that come from?
Well,
because you're not decreasing spending.
Well, in some areas there are spending decreases.
Not overall.
But most of it comes from additional tax revenues. Tax revenues have been...
Because we're allowing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act rates to expire, correct?
Partly, but...
about $2 trillion of $3 trillion. About $2 trillion. You're projecting an additional $2 trillion in revenue and counting that towards that.
We're projecting, in addition to that, a higher corporate income tax, moving that up to 28%, putting in place Pillar 2.
Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record an article from the Washington Post that shows the $2 trillion and talks about that being included in the budget, and then shows a significant portion of that will be taken by families who are earning less than $400,000.
He's explicitly said that he will not agree to raise taxes for people making under $400,000.
So I think it's more important.
And that is not any proposal of his. He's not said he would allow everything to expire.
So I think it's more important.
That is just wrong.
I think it's more important to look at what he's proposed rather than what he said. And very clearly, the $3 trillion in revenue or in reduction, what you're calling a reduction in debt, includes a significant amount coming from families who are earning under $400,000 per year.
Well, that will have to be paid for.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Yellen, it's always an honor to have you here. I want to thank you for your testimony and for taking the time to answer our questions today. With you at the helm, Treasury has helped the Biden administration rebuild and strengthen our economy for the benefit of American workers and families. Together, we've made real progress in terms of lowering costs for American families, from child care to health care to housing, not to mention creating 15 million jobs on President Biden's watch. The president's latest budget shows that this administration is committed to building out a fairer, more level playing field in our tax code. We need to recalibrate our nation's tax system to drive benefits towards working families who need them most, instead of the wealthy who benefited for the most part under the TCJA. I want to hone in on a small but very powerful way that Treasury recently helped families navigate our tax system. This tax filing season, the IRS launched a key cost-saving tool with Inflation Reduction Act funding For the first time, certain eligible taxpayers could choose to file their returns online directly with the IRS for free. More than 33,000 Californians opted into that pilot program, and it's pretty clear that Americans are hungry for an efficient, free, and direct filing option with the IRS. Because for a lot of Americans and a lot of my constituents, filing their taxes is confusing, it's frustrating, and it's time-consuming and oftentimes very expensive. Not everybody has the time or the disposable income to work with a paid tax preparer. And I think that all of our constituents can benefit greatly from a free and easy-to-use tool that helps them file accurate returns, but more importantly, make sure that they aren't leaving tax credits on the table. Secretary Yellen, I understand that the initial direct file pilot was limited in scope, and I can understand how when you've got a pilot project, keeping it small and nimble would allow the IRS to carefully track uptake as well as the participant feedback. What has Treasury been hearing from taxpayers who actually took the opportunity to file their taxes online for free and directly with the IRS?
So what I can tell you today, we haven't completely analyzed the information, is that the pilot was very successful. There was increasing interest from taxpayers during the 5-week interval it was available, and taxpayers shared that they found direct file easy to use, completed the process in about an hour, and on average taxpayers have been spending an average of 13 hours and $270 preparing their taxes each year. So the preliminary evidence suggests that this has been a very successful experiment.
It warms my heart to hear that. Can you talk to how the direct file can help families understand their eligibility for and their ability to claim certain tax credits like the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit?
So I believe I've not been through the entire, I've seen a demonstration, but the program, I believe, walks people through those areas to make sure that they're alerted to it and understand their eligibility.
Yeah, I know that oftentimes people aren't even aware of certain tax advantages that they can claim, and the direct file helps them to understand those. I want to give you, in the last minute that I have of my time, an opportunity to respond to the, somebody talked about inflation and costs going up, and unfortunately inflation is a real thing. But how does our inflation rate compare with that of most modernized countries around the world? And can you talk to the fact that if we allow certain provisions of the TCJA to expire, but keep in place other provisions, how that's going to benefit working families?
Well, with respect to inflation, inflation has come down considerably, and the measure that the Federal Reserve focuses on most over the last 12 months ran at 2.7%. But what's important to households, of course, they see that the prices of many goods they bought pre-pandemic are higher, not all, but some, is that their wages have gone up by more than that. So their purchasing power, their inflation-adjusted incomes are higher, not lower. And for example, even this morning, we saw new data come out on the Employment Cost Index that measures compensation, and it was up in nominal terms, and in inflation-adjusted terms, it showed that over the last year, compensation on average has increased just under a percentage point for most families. So people generally are better off in spite of the price increases, but we know we have more work to do, and President Biden is very focused on areas where he can lower costs, whether it's healthcare premiums, household energy expenses that will come down as because of the Inflation Reduction Act, drug prices, and the like. And so this remains a concern to many households, and it's something that's a high priority, getting costs down further.
I thank you for your time. I yield back.
Mr. Hearn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter for the record an article from Tax Notes titled Gain and Little Pain from New Bermuda Corporate Tax.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, as you might be aware, Bermuda is introducing its new corporate income tax that will take effect in 2025. Bermuda entities will be able to mark up their intangible assets to their estimated market value, and under the new law, they can amortize those assets over 10 years for tax purposes. Madam Secretary, this creation of a new deferred tax asset also results in a deferred tax expense. As you know, under general guidelines provided by the OECD for Pillar 2 that you negotiated, deferred tax expense or these amortized deductions will not trigger minimum tax liability that could be imposed by other globe participating countries. Bermuda has no intention of giving up its ability to attract business to the tax code. Other countries are adopting similar measures to maintain their status as an attractive jurisdiction at the expense of United States multinationals. We know about Singapore, we know about Ireland, the things they're doing to maintain their ability to use their tax code to lure companies there. Madam Secretary, are you concerned about the fact that Pillar 2 is creating a new tax subsidy race where countries enact Pillar 2 taxes but offset the higher tax costs with tax subsidies in the form of qualified refundable tax credits and other incentives like what Bermuda is doing?
Well, the idea of Pillar 2 is to level the playing field, and countries that refuse to raise their corporate tax rate up to the minimum, countries that participate and enact the minimum can, in effect, tax companies in tax havens that haven't done it. You've cited an example. I'm not aware that this is something that's broad-based, but if it is, it would certainly concern me, and it's something that I'd be prepared to look into.
Well, Madam Secretary, we've all seen what Ireland has said about putting a cap on recurring revenues. We've seen what Singapore has said in refundable tax credits. We've seen what China does in direct tax payments or direct access or cash payments to their companies to be able to offset the taxable income, so that they, in effect, from the look at it, that the minimum tax level would be hit, but companies in those countries are getting subsidies through direct credits that offset that and take it backwards, where ours aren't direct. Ours are not refundable. We have to actually earn income to be able to utilize those. Question 2, is this administration concerned that Pillar 2 incentivizes subsidy warfare that puts our adversaries like China at a competitive advantage?
It would concern me if it's incented that, but I'm not aware that that is broad-based at this point. And in our case, many of our tax credits, such as the green tax credits, the LIHTC credit, are being treated as refundable. As I've emphasized previously, we're working to make sure that the R&D tax credit also will be something that firms can
But Madam Secretary, I think you just validated that countries have the ability to make certain credits refundable to offset the minimum tax that other countries or OECD can claim to. China can do it. I think you're going there, evidence the fact that they're not always transparent in what they do, since all of their companies are basically owned by the CCP. Madam Secretary, I just want to talk about, I've got a longer question here, but it pertains to the same thing. I think there's a lot of work to be done. As you know, the Republicans on the committee went to the OECD and expressed our concern and made it very clear that Pillar 2 is not going to take place under a Republican-led Ways and Means Committee. And we're not going to give away our tax dollars. In fact, it's said time and time again about how many tax dollars, the U.S. taxpayer dollars, would go around the world, upwards of $200 billion. I know you said that was JCT's outward look, but I think it's important for everyone to know, and you know this to be certain. Corporations don't pay taxes. The people that work for the corporations, the consumers of the products of those corporations, and the owners of those corporations pay the taxes to increase pricing for whatever the commodities are. In fact, Forbes, Brookings, Tax Foundation, Cato, and many, many others have said that consumers pay 31% of the new taxes, workers pay 38% of the taxes. All of those people, for the most part, make less than $400,000 a year. So they're going, about 70% of the tax increase will be paid by people making less than $400,000 a year. Some portion of that. So I think it's disingenuous, as my colleague from Pennsylvania said, to say that no one is going to pay a single cent, as outlined in the White House's conversation about policy going forward. It's just disingenuous. It's not factual, and it's not honest with the American people. One other thing that you said is that the labor participation rate was better today than it was pre-COVID. I know you selectively picked an area.
For adults.
It was 63.3% on March 2020. Today it's 62.7. Overall workforce, when you don't have the luxury as an employer, as I did for 35 years, say, I'm only going to hire people working, you've got to be 25 years old or 54 years old.
We have an aging population, and as people retire, we know that labor force participation overall will decline over time.
Mr. Chair, you're back.
Thank you. You're good? Okay. Ms. Chu?
Secretary Yellen, I heard your comments earlier about the success of the direct file pilot program, and I was so glad to hear why it was a success. And I especially want to have you address some things that Republicans in the private tax prep industry are saying. They are attacking the numbers of the filers, 140,000 filers, to show that the pilot was a waste of money because there are 19 million who were eligible, and that this was unnecessary. And yet, what I see is that there were a lot of obstacles to the program that the IRS was able to overcome. And actually, I would have called it a resounding success. So can you tell us why it was considered a resounding success, considering the obstacles that there were, and what considerations will go into the decision to extend the pilot?
Well, let me say that this was an experiment, and it was deliberately introduced in a phased way, starting at small scale. It was only available to most filers for 5 weeks in a subset of states that decided to participate. So for that amount of time, 140,000 people using it and expressing positive reactions to the experience, I would certainly call a success. Additionally, because it's an experiment, only relatively simple tax situations could use it. If an individual went on and it turned out they had the kind of income that wasn't incorporated into the first iteration of this program, they were directed to do something else. But this saved a lot of taxpayers, even in this first stage, a lot of money that they normally spend and a lot of time. And there was customer service available for anybody that needed it. And so overall, I believe we'll see that the experience was a very positive one.
So it was deliberately at a number that could ensure its success, actually.
That's right, to start in a phased way.
Yeah, and I want to also express appreciation because you also made it available in both English and Spanish. My district in the San Gabriel Valley includes many limited English proficient taxpayers who speak not only Spanish, but also Tagalog, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, and Vietnamese. If the Treasury and IRS decide to renew the direct file pilot, can you talk about how it could reach more taxpayers by expanding to possibly even more languages?
Well, I'm sure that would be something that would be considered over time. There are other things that could be incorporated in addition to expanding the kinds of income and deductions that are considered. you know, eventually the information that the IRS gets on W-2s and other information reporting could be used to pre-populate returns, making it even easier. But these are things in the future if it's decided to continue with Free File.
Secretary Yellen, also I heard you talk earlier about the proposals that the administration has to end tax breaks for the wealthy and instead restore tax credits for workers and families, like the expanded child tax credit and the earned income tax credit of the American Rescue Plan. We know about the powerful effects of these tax credits on reducing poverty, but can you talk about how these programs will impact the American economy and improve things for everybody?
Well, I mean, a very good example would be the child tax credit, which in 2021 lifted 5.3 million people, including 2.9 million children, out of poverty. We saw a 46% decline in child poverty in 2021. And this is not only beneficial to the children and their parents in the short term, but we know from many studies that when poverty is reduced for children, it redounds to their benefit over the remainder of their lives.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. There are several votes on the floor. The committee stands in recess until immediately after the conclusion of this vote series. The hearing will come to order. Mr. Carey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Yellen, as you know, low carbon hydrogen can reduce carbon emissions and create much needed American jobs. Ohio is well positioned to lead on hydrogen given the state's proximity to the end markets, as well as its access to low cost, abundant, and diverse energy feedstocks. I believe Ohio can be a leader in hydrogen production from natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration, sometimes known as blue hydrogen. Our state has abundant storage capacity, carbon capture emissions, and unparalleled access to low-cost natural gas. But most importantly, we know hydrogen made with natural gas while using carbon capture and sequestration can produce very low emissions. Unfortunately, the administration's recently proposed regulations for hydrogen production tax credit 45V could halt several of the proposed Ohio projects. Last fall, DOE selected the Appalachian Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub centered around the Ohio River Valley, an area that I know very well, as the official hydrogen hub. Natural gas will play a major role in the overwhelming majority of these projects. This hub alone would create up to 18,000 construction jobs, with about 3,000 of those jobs being permanent. Without a workable, flexible 45V guidance, many of the projects within the hub will be uneconomical. Clear, inclusive tax guidance can help increase much needed economic certainty that there will be adequate supply of hydrogen to meet the needs of Ohio's industries that are already making investments to use hydrogen in their businesses. I recommend that the Treasury permit taxpayers to use actual EPA-verified greenhouse gas emissions data to calculate an accurate tax credit value rather than being forced to use a baseless national average as laid out in the proposed regulations. Companies investing in lower methane intensity natural gas to produce hydrogen should be able to demonstrate the low carbon intensity of the produced hydrogen with EPA verified data, then use the data to calculate the corresponding tax credit value. The purpose of the tax credit and the intent of Congress is to drive the incremental and continual reductions in the carbon intensity of hydrogen. Without this change, to the proposed rule to permit hydrogen producers to prove the actual carbon intensity of their hydrogen, the 45E tax credit will drastically mischaracterize carbon emissions intensity, which will stifle the development of low carbon hydrogen products and impede the administration's goal at reducing the overall emissions. And I know this is probably not something that a lot of people talk about, but given the fact that Ohio does have the aquifers to hold carbon, it is something that's very important to our state. I only have 1:30. If you have a second, I wouldn't mind your response.
Well, the hydrogen provisions of IRA are very important, and we've worked hard to put out a notice of proposed rulemaking that will provide some clarity and flexibility to let projects advance with the appropriate environmental safeguards. We've worked very closely with the Department of Energy and with EPA on the proposed regs, given their technical expertise, but this is very complex and it requires evaluating life cycle emissions. We have received many comments, I believe over 40,000 comments on the proposed rule. I appreciate your comments, and we promise that we're sifting through them and need to reconsider what's the appropriate response is. So what I can say is that we will take this input seriously as we work to revise the regulations.
And I do appreciate that. I just want to say again, with the developments that we have in place, Ohio looks to get 18,000 construction jobs, 3,000 permanent jobs. This could be a very big economic factor for the state of Ohio. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Del Bene.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for taking the time to be with us here today. And thank you for your attention to the needs of working families and struggling Americans, and for the work that you do to keep America globally competitive.
Thank you.
Madam Secretary, I first want to give you a chance to clarify the administration's position on the child tax credit, something I'm a big supporter of. I know that some assertions were made and you didn't have a chance to respond, so I want to give you a chance to respond.
The President is supportive of the child tax credit, and he's proposed to extend it in his 2025 budget, and he's been supportive of Wyden-Smith also, the provisions on the child tax credit that are included there. Obviously, it's made a tremendous difference when it was in effect in 2021, reduced child poverty by 46%, and is very important and an important provision that really helps working families.
Absolutely, and I'd love to see us put that in place and make that permanent. So that's work we're going to continue to focus on. The Inflation Reduction Act also included a historic $80 billion investment in the IRS, $20 billion which was rescinded by my Republican colleagues. But one of the key needs addressed by these funds was modernizing the agency's core technology infrastructure. As this technology is updated, I wondered if you could speak about how are emerging technologies like artificial intelligence being integrated into the IRS's work to provide services to taxpayers and to enforce tax laws, and how is the IRS addressing data privacy and security concerns inherent with such technologies?
So the IRS certainly has already begun to use AI in its work. I'm not an expert on this, but I know that they see great potential in terms on the enforcement side in being able to sift through tax returns of high-income filers and complex partnerships and corporations, and to identify which ones would be good candidates for audits and trying to uncover fraud and close the tax gap. Treasury has a governance process where we're employing AI increasingly in Treasury's work, and we've put in place oversight and a governance process around that to make sure that it's used responsibly in accordance with the President's executive order.
Under your leadership, Treasury recently closed a loophole in our Russian seafood ban that previously allowed fish caught in Russia to still get to the U.S. if processing occurred in a third country like China. The ban is working, but unless our allies act in concert, American seafood will remain at a competitive disadvantage to Russian seafood in foreign markets. Madam Secretary, I wondered how can Treasury push our allies who are also large seafood importers, including Japan, Canada, the EU, and the UK, to cut off seafood trade with Russia?
So I must admit, I'm not intimately knowledgeable in what we're doing on this particular aspect of sanctions, but we're constantly working with our allies to try to coordinate our sanctions so that they're effective.
And then one I know you will have, and I probably won't give you enough time on this, but I wondered if you could talk about how suggesting the U.S. will never implement Pillar 2 makes it more difficult to get the changes that we would like to see.
In
Pillar 2 of the OECD.
To see the changes, how does it make it more difficult?
About how when folks are suggesting that we're never going to implement Pillar 2, how that makes it more difficult for us to get the changes that we would like to see.
Well, this was a global agreement. The United States led the push on this, and we've argued since day one that Pillar 2 is something that's good for the entire world. We've pushed our allies. Now, on the order of 40 countries have adopted it, most major countries, and I think they see it as a failure on our part not to be willing to adopt it ourselves. And so it does undermine our ability to exhibit leadership with our allies.
Thank you. My time's expired. Thank you, Madam Secretary. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Maliotakis.
Thank you very much for being here. I'm proud to represent Staten Island and Brooklyn, where you're from, and Fort Hamilton High School says hello.
Thank you.
And I wanted to speak with you specifically about fentanyl. And the involvement of the Communist Chinese Party. I know you recently returned from a trip from fentanyl. You specifically talked about the money laundering that is involved. We know that Communist China is subsidizing the production of these fentanyl analogs that are now illegal in the United States and in China, but yet they are exporting it, killing, as you know, 100,000 Americans annually. A lot of it is going through the drug cartels in Mexico, in particular when they're subsidizing the production of this fentanyl in China. NPP and ANPP are two fentanyl precursors that we know specifically the Mexican drug cartels are using. So according to the Congressional Research Service, U.S. destined illicit fentanyl appears to be produced clandestinely in Mexico using these chemical precursors from China. Earlier this month, you reported on your trip that you were creating a joint Treasury, People's Bank of China cooperation and exchange on money laundering. So just wanted to know where this group is at, what you think we'll be able to derive from this to help save these American lives that are being lost, sadly, because of this interaction between the CCP and the Mexican drug cartels.
So I think fentanyl is a critical issue, as you've indicated, and Treasury is doing everything that we can to stem the flow of precursors from China to Mexico and the illegal sale of fentanyl from Mexico into the United States. I've also visited Mexico to discuss the fentanyl issue and to enhance our cooperation with them. In the case of China, President Biden and President Xi, when they met, I guess it was in November, in Woodside, agreed to jointly tackle fentanyl, which was a very good development. Meetings have been taking place. As you noted, in my recent trip, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, to China, we agreed to establish a special work, sort of dialogue or work plan around illicit finance. We've had one meeting so far that's been devoted to that topic, and fentanyl certainly is one of the key issues, although we're looking more broadly at illicit finance beyond fentanyl. But China's agreed to cooperate with us to try to stem the sale of these precursors into Mexico and other places, and this is an area of cooperation.
So it's your understanding that these money laundering organizations in the PRC are acting outside of the CCP's control?
I think so. I don't. It's not my understanding that the CCP is positively directing this activity, but that it is taking place among Chinese firms. And we need their cooperation to clamp down on those firms. We've sanctioned some, but there are many smaller firms in China that I believe are involved in producing these precursors and other equipment that's needed.
The U.S. Department of Treasury, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, has so far sanctioned more than 65 mainland China or Hong Kong-based persons for illicit fentanyl trafficking. And we also seen the DOJ take some action indicting 3 of the PRC-based companies. So I'm glad to see that we're having some action taken. Any of these firms, again, everything in China obviously has the government's involvement in it. So my concern is more that the manufacturers of this fentanyl are being subsidized by the government. They obviously control the banks in China, and then on top of it, these PRC-based companies. So I'm just wondering how much we can trust them as partners. I'm hoping that you're making some progress in that, but the reality is that, we're seeing this increase, not decrease. More Americans are dying as a result of this fentanyl that is streaming from the PRC to the Mexican cartel. Part of it is because of our open southern border, thanks to the president's 60-plus policy changes when he came in. So I just hope that you will work diligently, and I trust that you are, to really try to hold China accountable for this type of activity that we're seeing that are killing so many Americans.
It's a real American tragedy, and we will do everything and are doing everything we can to stem the flow of these drugs into our country.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary, Madam Secretary, welcome again to our committee. I want to talk to you about equity and the President's charge to his cabinet at the very beginning of his administration to really try to level the playing field and have equity be one of the hallmarks of that. And I had an opportunity to sit with you. I think we had breakfast together. During the last Congress, Congressman Richie Neal put together a racial equity initiative within Ways and Means, and had a chance to talk to you about some of the things that you were thinking about doing in terms of equity. The budget is truly a reflection of what we value. We spend money on those things that we value. I want to commend this administration and yourself for including in this budget expanding the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, the low-income housing tax credit. I was a bond lawyer before I was a member of Congress, and new market tax credits are a way to really help depress and distress communities. Can you talk a little bit about how the earned income tax credit and the low-income tax housing tax credit will seek to level the playing field and our equity initiatives within Treasury, frankly?
Thank you. I think all of the initiatives that you mentioned, the new markets tax credit, which we're proposing to make permanent, and also add a track that would be particularly focused on the most distressed communities. The earned income tax credit would be extended to single individuals with low incomes, it was done in the ARP.
Yes.
And this would make that permanent. Of course, the child tax credit has been critically, when it was expanded in 2021, critically important in reducing child poverty, reduced it by 46%. And
amazing. And so the fact that in the FY 25 budget, that you would actually make permanent the earned income tax credit, and some of those are very, very important. I noticed also that that the president's budget provides a new mortgage relief credit. Can you talk a little bit about what that one is?
Well, homeownership for people who don't already own homes, first-time buyers, is almost prohibitively expensive. First of all, mortgage rates have been so low for so long that it's created a kind of lock-in across much of the country where people don't want to sell their homes to buy new ones because they'll lose the benefit of the low mortgage rates they've locked in. And then with house prices having gone up, and now with much higher interest in mortgage rates, it's almost impossible for first-time buyers. So the president has proposed a pair of tax credits. One would go $10,000, I believe, to purchases of new homes, and the other would go to individuals who are willing to sell their homes to try to get rid of some of that lock-in. But we know that affordable housing, and especially starter homes, is an area where we really need to do a lot to increase availability.
Increase availability and also access, as well as making sure that we're leveling the playing field so that all Americans have an opportunity to live the American dream.
Yes.
Going back to the new market tax credits, I represent my home district, Alabama 7th District, and we've utilized new market tax credits to help underserved urban, but also rural parts of my district to actually, we're beneficiaries of this. As you know, new market tax credits really let cities and counties and nonprofits to given an opportunity to really help a distressed area. Can you talk a little bit about why that permanency with new market tax credits is so critical?
I think because this is intended to generate private investment and is very successful in doing it, knowing that the program will be there over time, I think generates much more interest in the part of the private
and more certainty.
sector.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I yield back the balance of my time.
Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Neal. And welcome here today, Secretary Yellen. I'm going to be on a little different track than my friend from Alabama. I'm deeply concerned about many of the action that the Treasury Department and President Biden's administration are taking. Unfortunately, every American is feeling the constant pinch of inflation, higher interest rates, and lower purchasing power. Despite this, the Treasury and the IRS appear to be only trying to make our constituents' lives worse instead of better. For example, the IRS has continued to illegally delay the implementation of the Democrat draconian 1099-K threshold. The Treasury Department has issued weak foreign entity of concern definitions to that which fail to protect American tax dollars from flowing to Chinese companies. Guidance coming from the Treasury Department on energy tax incentives are blocking traditional energy communities from participating in the future energy economy and leaving them behind. You have led an unprecedented attack on American taxpayer privacy by overseeing the expansion of IRS snooping and yet failing to crack down on the leaks of sensitive taxpayer documents. Furthermore, the IRS has wasted millions of taxpayer dollars on its unauthorized direct file program. The Biden administration has shockingly announced its plan to raise taxes by over $7 trillion next year. You said last month under oath that there is no plan to protect middle-class taxpayers from these planned increases. On the world stage, we've surrendered the U.S. tax base to unelected global bureaucrats at the OECD and failed to protect the American tax system from what I think of as a heinous international interference. On every front, the American taxpayer loses. Our nation becomes weaker, and our global adversaries are rewarded and emboldened. Secretary Yellen, I'm deeply concerned about our domestic industry's reliance on Chinese technologies and investments. As the recently appointed chairwoman of the Supply Chains Tax Team, I look forward to working with my colleagues to improve upon the broken IRA's energy credits, protecting a competitive corporate rate, and ensuring that the United States is the best place to invest, as it was under President Trump's historic tax cuts. I've introduced two bills, the Protecting American Advanced Manufacturing Act and the End Chinese Dominance of Electric Vehicles Act, to improve on the Foreign Entity of Concern definitions for the 45X and the 30D tax credits, respectively. The current agreements establish a dangerous precedent that will take the U.S. decades to reverse by creating a future where our automotive and other industries are heavily reliant on foreign technologies. Without immediate passage of both of my bills, Chinese entities will receive billions of American tax dollars every single year. Secretary Yellen, yes or no? Does the Biden administration support taxpayer dollars funding Chinese entities?
Well, when it comes to electric vehicles, the IRA, which obviously the administration supports, has foreign entity of concern restrictions coming into effect this year and next, which will severely curtail, almost prevent entirely participation of Chinese firms in producing components or minerals or processing
That's not
that
yes
go
or no.
into batteries.
That's not.
So that's a very significant restriction that will protect our supply chain. With respect to 45X, that's a credit that Congress directed to go to any company that undertakes certain advanced manufacturing in the United States.
By allowing these Chinese companies to maintain control of the technologies, the intellectual property, and the supply chains, all while receiving American taxpayer subsidies, how will this encourage U.S. companies to develop the technologies to become less dependent upon China and our adversaries? It doesn't. Does the Biden administration share any of my concern that China is using various IRA credits to deepen its influence on our domestic manufacturing industries?
The United States is doing everything we can in Treasury in implementing the IRA to strengthen our supply chains and make them less vulnerable to China.
Well, continue to remain skeptical on the environmental and economic benefits behind your decision-making, and I do urge swift passage of my bills to further protect the United States manufacturing, and I yield back my time.
And of course, Secretary Yellen, it's always good to be in your presence with your just wise experience. This committee is really blessed. I want to ask you a couple of questions related to domestic violence, sexual violence. The 2013 amendments to the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, which I had the privilege and the opportunity to lead, really made some changes to prohibit housing providers who've used the low-income housing tax credit from using domestic violence, dating violence, or sexual assault and stalking as grounds for evicting the victim or denying subsidies or admissions due to an abuser's act. The IRS, of course, is not just the administrator of the housing tax credits. It has a duty to ensure that the low-income housing tax credit program's compliance is with VAWA. I think we've had some informal communication with the Treasury Department in this past decade, where the Treasury has disavowed any responsibility to set out some sort of guidance on this. And in fact, in 10 years, we have not seen that done. And so I was wondering, and I'm joining Ms. Tenney. She and I are writing you a letter to try to find out what the status of that, why you don't feel that you need to comply, or if you do, if you will, Madam Secretary.
Well, first, let me thank you for your work on this very important initiative, which I think is critically important for domestic violence victims. And the reauthorization explicitly extended VAWA's protections to applicants and tenants in LIHTC properties. Now, if there are specific issues or guidance that you think is necessary, I'd like to put you and your staff in touch with people at the Treasury and IRS, and we would be glad to work with you.
Well, thank you with that, because the national housing authorities have put together some sort of guidance that seems to be working, and we will share that with you. Mr. Schmucker and I, as an extension of this discussion, I want to talk about something we think is extraordinary, and that is judgments that are made for victims of sexual assault. If you're a victim of sexual assault and you get a settlement or an award, you will be able to get a settlement and not pay taxes on it if you can prove that there's some physical harm. But as an example, I mean, if you were put in a situation where you were forced to strip naked and parade, through a gang of perpetrators, and no one penetrated you, you might get a judgment out of that, but you'd have to pay taxes on it. We don't think that that's fair. And so we are looking, Mr. Smucker and I, to changing the law so that there's a presumption of a physical abuse that would meet the requirements for some kind of income exclusion. And so we are hoping that you will see this in the positive light that we see it.
With that statement, more, that's exactly right. China's state-backed solar industry is flooding the global market with cheap products, undercutting our American workers at a time when we're trying to build that capacity. So to meet this challenge, of course, we need policy that drives demand for U.S. manufactured solar products across the solar supply chain. And we can do this with strong domestic content rules. And so my question to you comes out of a concern that domestic content guidance may leave out some critical pieces of the solar supply chain. And so I'm curious what Treasury's plan is to ensure that the final domestic content guidance for solar facilities incentivizes onshoring of the full U.S. solar supply chain and reduces our dependence on China for components like, for example, polysilicon or wafer. Could you comment on that?
Sure. Well, we put out some initial guidance on domestic content. It was an interagency effort, and we relied heavily on advice from the Department of Transportation in applying the Buy America rules that are referenced in the text of the IRA in determining the categorization of clean energy products. We also consulted with the Department of Energy. Now, we've gotten a lot of public feedback. Some of it, much of it is from stakeholders throughout the solar supply chain, and this is feedback we will take into account as we revise the regulations.
I do very much appreciate that. I think it's such an important element to make sure that we're looking at the entirety of that supply chain, because there's a lot of American jobs that could be stood up simply on some of those elements. And I wonder if you could also comment on another subject that you and I have discussed before, and that's the 48D semiconductor investment tax credit, making sure that we expand the U.S. supply chain for semiconductors starts with polysilicon. And again, you and I have discussed this, a substance that's 99.5% of semiconductor chips. The U.S. has a technological advantage on polysilicon production, but China and other countries are catching up, and that's one of the reasons that the new tax credit in the CHIPS and Science Act is intended to spur that investment in the semiconductor supply chain. And so I wonder if you might comment on your willingness of Treasury to continue to work with us on final guidance for the 48D tax credit that supports those critical elements of the semiconductor supply chain. And as you know, for me, it's important that that include American-made chip-grade polysilicon.
So again, I would say that we put out some proposed rules and received a lot of feedback. We explicitly asked questions about the appropriate scope. I'd also say that the Department of Commerce that administers a grant program, we're coordinating closely with them to make sure we cover the entire supply chain. I can't preview the likely final rules, but we have been very attentive to comment that we've received on this.
I very much appreciate that. And as you know, Congress takes these actions. We have an interest in the implementation process. It's the responsibility of the administration, but we have an interest as the authors of the legislation to ensure that congressional intent is being realized. So I appreciate your willingness to work with us, and I particularly appreciate your service to our country in the various roles that we've worked together. You do a fine job and are doing a particularly fine job at this hearing.
Thank you so much, Congressman Kildee. Appreciate that.
Mr. Stubbe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, on March 6, 2024, the Committee on Judiciary and Select Committee of the Weaponization of the Federal Government released a staff report on the financial surveillance in the United States. Have you had a chance to review that?
I'm aware of it, but I haven't reviewed it in detail.
Well, I would encourage you to read it because it's pretty appalling to the American people. Last week, Chairman Jordan sent you a letter regarding the financial surveillance without a warrant of American citizens. The date, actually, let me go back. So, Mr. Chairman, can I add that report I ask unanimous consent to add that report to the record?
Without objection.
Last week, April 24th, Chairman Jordan sent you a letter regarding the financial surveillance without a warrant of the American citizens. Are you in receipt of that letter?
We are in receipt.
Have you read it?
I've looked at it.
You've looked at it? Does that mean you've read it, or is
yes.
that? Okay. Do you intend to provide the committee with the SARs as requested in that letter?
We will respond to the committee.
Are you going to provide the SARs as requested in the letter?
Well, those reports are strictly confidential under the law, and I'm not prepared to discuss any one particular.
I'm just asking if you're going to comply with the letter that Chairman Jordan, that has oversight over your department and the cabinet, if you're going to comply with the letter.
We will respond to the letter, and I don't really have more to say about that.
Under the Biden Secrecy Act, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, an agency under your control, the Department of Treasury, receives vast amounts of data covering millions of financial transactions involving everyday Americans. Is that correct?
Through FinCEN receives reports.
And is it correct that FinCEN received 20.6 million currency transaction reports in 2022?
I'm not sure. It could be.
Could be, roughly, more or less?
I don't know the number.
But you would agree that it's millions of reports?
Probably, yes.
It's also true that FinCEN received 4.3 million suspicious activity reports in 2022, which was nearly double the amount received by the agency in 2029.
I don't know.
You don't know at all, even though it's
I don't know if they received double the previous year. I really don't know.
So would you? But SARS typically gets millions of reports. You would agree with that?
I don't know if it doubled though.
Okay, well, I'm sure your staff can provide you with that information.
I'm sure they can.
Agency under your, so you don't know, is what you're telling me?
I could look into it, but I don't happen to know.
Okay, doesn't the data in these reports include important and sensitive private financial data?
Well, these are private data only available to law enforcement.
But it includes data of American citizens, their private financial data, correct?
Well, on transactions that are regarded as suspicious
And their data,
and potentially illegal.
The sensitive personal financial data included in this report is held in a database, correct?
Yes.
Neither FinCEN nor any federal law enforcement agencies needs to get a warrant to access this private financial data. Is that correct?
I don't think you need to get a warrant, but it's only shared subject to strict confidentiality.
But you don't need to get a warrant.
Not to the best of my knowledge.
Are you aware that in 2021, FinCEN emailed financial institutions suggesting search terms including, and I quote, America First, quote, Trump, and MAGA to use in identifying transactions that may indicate, and I quote, involvement in riots or potential violence?
This is activity that took place under the previous administration, not under the Biden administration, in close proximity.
No, this is 2021.
Right? This is
2021.
This is before the President Biden's inauguration.
No, it's after.
And after January 6th. And there was concern about potential disruption of his inaugural. And FinCEN worked as it's instructed to do with financial institutions to try to uncover who was involved in January 6th.
So are you aware of the FinCEN emailing the financial institutions with those search terms?
I am now aware that there were communications that took place. In some cases, I believe financial institutions suggested to this group search terms they had used that had been helpful in identifying potential perpetrators of January 6th.
FinCEN also worked with the FBI in early 2021 to determine certain transaction thresholds for SARs. These include certain weapons-related transactions. Do you know how many SARs were filed as a result of the FBI and FinCEN's coordination at that time?
No, the only reason that I believe that weapons were involved, it's never a search term used on its own that results in anything. It's a way of trying to narrow the scope of search for individuals who, based on other information available to the financial institution, may have been guilty of illegal behavior.
Without a warrant. Mr. Chairman, I ask that the letter from Chairman Jordan to Secretary Yellen dated April 24th is added to the record.
Without objection. Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary, for being here today. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, passed by President Trump, provided tax relief to millions of middle-class Americans and their families. The doubling of the standard deduction, the doubling of the child tax credit, and the adjusting of individual tax rates saved working-class people significant money on their tax bills. President Biden's comments have already been mentioned several times today, and he told the American people flat out that he intends to let the Trump tax cuts expire and remain expired. You've repeatedly said today that the president has no tax plan, only principles from which he will negotiate. Let me just say that allowing the Trump tax cuts to expire on middle-income Americans seems like a misguided principle to me. So let me ask you this, Madam Secretary. If the Trump tax cuts expire and President Biden fails to pass his tax plan, which actually currently doesn't exist, which Americans will pay less in taxes?
President Biden has made absolutely clear that he opposes increasing taxes on people earning less than $400,000, and he supports cutting taxes for working people and families with children to give them more breathing room. And he will work with Congress to try to achieve that.
Ma'am, reclaiming my time. Thank you. Isn't it true that nearly all middle-income individuals and families would pay more with the expiration of the Trump tax cuts?
Some individuals would, but President Biden has said he would oppose allowing tax cuts to expire for people making under $400,000.
But my understanding, though, is that he doesn't really have a tax plan, he just has ideas. And so how are you going to translate that into what?
There will be a negotiation over what to do when these tax cuts expire. And the president, as he does in many other situations, will negotiate with Congress.
But I think that if you let these expire, you are going to see increases. You are going to see increases. And without an alternative, I mean, we just, right now, what you're saying is there's just an idea out there.
There are
right
principles.
now, there are principles, principles, same thing, there's no real plan, and you're gonna he's gonna let these tax cuts that people are recognizing that they are seeing right now expire with just principles that
There will be a negotiation, and in that negotiation, he will oppose any tax increases on families earning under $400,000 at the same time that he will oppose keeping in place benefits that went to the wealthy.
And maybe you addressed this earlier, but is he going to tell us what these principles are? Is he going to give us some
He's
concrete?
told you what the principles are.
Okay.
I'm telling you what the
well,
principles
then
are.
there's just not, I mean, we're supposed to rely on these ideas, principles, whatever you want to call them, when we have solid tax cuts right here, and they shouldn't be allowed to expire, because just a single parent making $52,000 a year with 2 kids would pay an average of $1,474 more in taxes if these expire. A married couple with 2 kids making $85,000 a year would pay on average of $1,661 more in taxes if these expire. A retired married couple making $48,000 a year would pay an average of $340 more in taxes if these expire. That's real dollars to these people, and that are paying these taxes and are recognizing and are seeing these breaks under the Trump tax cuts. And so to just say that for the president just to say he's going to let them expire doesn't seem very responsible, because these are real people that are paying that would pay more taxes. And so I guess we just are supposed to rely on the principles and the idea that he'll come up with something through negotiation to help these people. So with that, I yield back.
Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. As others have said, thank you for your work on behalf of our country and the American people. I'm just briefly going to pick up on some of the things that we've been hearing, but when we talk about, and you mentioned, we laid out principles, and I think the principles have been very clear. What Democrats are trying to do is try to bring down costs for working families to help them make ends meet. In the American Rescue Plan, we cut child poverty in this country by 50% through the child tax cut. And I think next year, given the chance, we're going to do that, and not just try to cut it by 50%, but in the wealthiest country in the world, no child in this country should be living in poverty, and we shouldn't be willing to accept that. We're investing in housing. The low-income housing tax credit that addresses a critical need for families and workers around this country to have access to quality housing. And R&D. We grow our economy by investing in innovation, and these are things that the 2017 tax law didn't do. So I could spend my whole 5 minutes on that. I don't want to spend my time. I really want to hear more from you. But one of the things that we did with the Inflation Reduction Act, among many great accomplishments, was we made the single largest investment in climate change. It was truly remarkable. And part of that was a tax credit for sustainable aviation fuel that I was proud to lead on. And I'm working to make sure that we implement that and extend that for the future. So at the risk of asking a question you may not be able to answer, but can you give us any sense of the criteria or objectives that Treasury is using in thinking about how to issue the rule for sustainable aviation fuel, and any update on forthcoming guidance that we might be expecting?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to thank you so much for your leadership on the SAF credit, and I want to tell you that today is the day that we're releasing a notice today that will catalyze innovation in the aviation industry and incentivize the production of cleaner and more sustainable aviation fuels. And I think it will make the United States a leader in decarbonizing aviation. So we're announcing the release today of a notice that will provide clarity around eligibility for the SAF credit. And at the same time, we'll also be releasing an updated model of the GREET model, which is applicable, will enable firms to determine exactly the credit that they're eligible for under the SAF. I think it will provide the clarity that people have been looking for, and this should occur this afternoon sometime.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm so excited to hear that not only is it forthcoming, but it's coming today. I know that's critically important. Aviation accounts for more than 2% of greenhouse gas emissions. Through sustainable aviation fuel, we have the possibility of doing more than a 50% reduction and maybe getting it down further from that. So I can't emphasize how important this is. I also know that you have a heart out, so I'm going to yield back the balance of my time so that more of my colleagues will have a chance to ask questions, but I thank you for your time.
Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Yellen, thank you for being here. I remember our visit last time. I appreciate these days. I know they're long days for you with a lot of questions coming from multiple directions, but this is an important, one of the more important hearings that we'll do all year. So this is going to sound like a gotcha question to start off with. It is not. I want to expound on it and have a really thoughtful discussion on the corporate tax rate because it's based on our conversation last time and a continuation of that. But would you agree, can we at least say that we agree that tax policy does have an impact on our economy?
It can, yes.
Tax policy does have an impact. So this is the part that's frustrating me as I hear from my Democratic colleagues today about, we've got such a great economy today, and we've had such a great strong recovery and all this kind of the bare bones of our economy are still in place from the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act. We saw strong economic growth. We saw real wage growth come from the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and I can speak so favorably about it. I wasn't even in Congress then, so I'm not even boasting about this. As I watched COVID hit and threw everything off into the world, and then when Democratic control took over in 2021, there was massive spending, but the same tax code, the same tax rate still existed. Some things were starting to trail off. I hope to be able to reestablish the R&D tax credits as well as everybody on this committee, basically. But we have seen a strong economic recovery. Unemployment is low, and I can absolutely point that to the fact that we have had a consistent, simpler tax code that strengthened middle class and lower income Americans since 2017. The part that concerns me is a book that I recently read. It's called Never Split the Difference. Tax rate was 35%. 2017, we lowered it to 21, and now President Biden just wants to do 28. It almost feels like lazy to me that we're just going to say, well, okay, because you admitted last time you were here when we were having our conversation, I do believe it was too high, and now I believe it's too low. So we're just going to split the difference. But the part that I want to hit on here is, according to the Tax Foundation, the top combined marginal rate on corporate income under current law is actually 25.6%, and the president's proposal would increase that to 32.2%, a corporate tax rate that would be the second highest in the OECD, behind Colombia. The Joint Committee on Tax has shown that most of the cost of a 28% corporate tax rate would be borne by Americans making less than $500,000. What specific analysis can you point to demonstrating that raising the corporate tax rate won't impose burdens on low and middle income Americans?
Well, I think all of the analysis I'm familiar with shows that TCJA, including the corporate tax cut, was a regressive tax cut that disproportionately benefited the wealthy and large corporations. And the corporate tax cut enriched corporate shareholders at the expense of the alternative, which would have been benefits to middle-class families.
So if I could jump in.
It promised an investment boom, and that certainly never materialized. You said that the economy did well, but I don't believe it did well because of that piece of legislation.
Okay,
And
thank you, and I'll reclaim my time. I don't believe you can argue, and if you want to come to the Utah's first district, you can hear from companies in that district where their real wage income grew for their frontline employees. This wasn't just for all of the shareholders like it's oftentimes communicated. We will see that as we just try to split the difference on this tax policy, that cost will go directly to the consumer. Take a retail company or a Home Depot or a Lowe's. If we put that extra tax burden on them, there's only one place to put it. They still have to pay their employees. They're going to have to raise income. They're going to have to raise prices on consumers. And I don't know of any analysis that would refute that.
Well, there's an interesting recent paper that shows that there were some benefits that went to wage earners from the corporate tax cut, but it was almost exclusively to the highest income earners within corporations, that virtually none of it went to the massive workers at these firms.
And that hasn't been my experience talking to actual companies in my actual district. I know it's considered a strong talking point from my colleagues on the left, but that hasn't been the experience. Companies had extra income that they could reinvest in their companies. They would keep it onshore. And this is the part that I just dig into that frustrates me so bad. And I'm already over time, and I appreciate the conversation, and I believe next time we'll continue to talk about the corporate tax rate.
Ms. Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to highlight the provision from TCJA that has been bipartisan support for and drive the intangible income deduction or FDII incentives companies to keep intellectual properties here in the United States. This allows companies to invent and make new creative works here, including my home state of California. We are also competing with countries provide max tax incentives to attract innovative companies. And FDII ensure that United States remain the best place to develop global solutions and technologies for the future. And we must protect this provision created in TCJA. This is the reason why I am introducing Growing and Preserving Innovation in America Act. This bipartisan legislation will permanently preserve the current FDII deduction rate. Secretary Yellen, that you've been here for such a long time, and I really appreciate it. And I just want to do the follow-up question that Congressman Winthrop asked you about China and the OECD. That under TCJA, that U.S. corporate tax lowered to 21%, and China is 25%, but there are actually certain companies up to 15%. So they're kind of like a corporate tax rate is low. If the United States raises corporate tax rate to 28%, and we adopt the new global minimum tax rate, the U.S. will forfeit tens of billions of dollars that we've been talking about. That Pillar 1, we're going to lose about $120 billion, and Pillar 2, about $40 billion. And, you know, actually, we did a Codel trip to France and Germany. French government didn't even want to meet us because they are gaining about $4 to $5 billion from these, the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. So this will hurt the U.S. economy, I believe. And the plan being discussed fails to hold China accountable, since I'm on Select Committee on China, so we've been really watching it, that you know what's going on with China. So if I heard right, that you assume the earlier that China will join the OECD agreement, what assurances do you have that they would truly comply with the rules and not continue to abusing the system like they have done so many times on the international level? And why should we give the CCP on economic advantages on the back of American taxpayers?
Okay, well, you covered a lot of different things, but let me respond on China and Pillar 2. You know, this is an agreement that contains an enforcement mechanism That's one of the reasons it's so powerful. If a country doesn't go along with it, doesn't raise their minimum tax rate on their multinationals to the agreed upon level, other countries that have complied and put it into effect can tax firms based in countries that are not going along with it. That applies to China. If China doesn't raise taxes on its multinationals and they operate in the United States, the U.S. will impose taxes by, it's called the undertaxed payment rule. We will impose taxes on those Chinese corporations, and we'll collect the tax revenue, and we will make sure that those companies do pay a 15% minimum tax so that they don't have unfair competition with our companies. Now, if China imposes the tax, they can collect the tax revenue. But if they won't do it, we're going to collect the tax revenue, and we're going to tax the Chinese firms. And this works to our advantage, not to China's.
I'm not really sure that, China's been always like, for them, that stealing is much cheaper than, researching, and it just takes longer time, it's much faster. So I don't know they can really follow the rules of, and then they're gonna raise taxes to comply the, global minimum tax. So having said that, I wanna go to my question that another expiring provision in the TCJA is enhanced standard deduction. This is a guaranteed tax deduction for hardworking Americans who want to file simple tax returns. And you were talking about actually simple tax returns that about 140,000 people filed it because the IRS system that it's been changed. If this provision expires, taxes will go up on hardworking families. Do you support the increased standard deduction created by TCJA and support keeping these individual tax cuts for hardworking Americans making less than $400,000 who do not want to maneuver a more complex tax system that exists?
The gentlelady's time has expired.
The president supports no tax increases on families making under $400,000.
I'll just make just one statement because most of new audits from IRS are targeted more on the making taxpayers making under that's $200,000. So that $400,000 kind of like assume numbers. But you know what? Having said that, I have a few questions and I'm going to submit in writing.
Thank you. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Will the gentleman suspend? We have about 28 minutes left of your time, Madam Secretary, so we're going to try to keep it on time going forward here, and I would appreciate all the members to respect that time. Thank you.
I don't have to.
Go ahead, Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I have to leave at 2:15.
2:15. We better talk fast then.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here today. I want to talk about Social Security, one of the most foundation anti-poverty programs that our country has ever created. Something I want to stress that it is a earned benefit. So the question I want to ask Madam Secretary, the House Republican Study Committee proposed Social Security budget would cut Social Security by $1.5 trillion over the next decade. Can you please describe how this plan would impact the recipients for whom Social Security make up either the majority or the entire of their income for retired years?
Well, Social Security is a critical program that keeps millions, tens of millions of people who are retired, our seniors, out of poverty. And President Biden has made it clear he would never support cuts in benefits to those individuals.
So what exactly in your mind that you think this House Republican Study Committee is attempting or suggesting? You have any idea what you think they're trying to suggest?
I'm not sure exactly what they are suggesting, but they may be suggesting benefit cuts, raising the retirement age. I'm not sure what's in their list of suggestions.
That's basically what I want to get understanding. If you don't have an idea, we don't have an idea. So I want to be very clear. We thank you for all that you have done. And we thank for the service that you have done. We really appreciate and value that. Thank you. Back to you, Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, gentlemen from Pennsylvania. By the way, I chair that committee, so if you need to help on what this policy is doing, I'd love to sit down and chat with you. With that, I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Secretary Yellen. Thank you for testifying here today on the President's budget for fiscal year 25. Secretary Yellen, in the current budget plan outlined by this administration, it assumes that the tax cut and jobs provisions will expire at the end of 2025, and under that plan, the child tax credit and the standard deduction both will be cut in half. So my first question, Secretary Yellen, could you walk me through this decision by the administration and how you plan to protect the economic security of Americans who qualify, as it is Americans on the lower end of the economic scale that benefit the most from these two provisions?
Well, the President's budget is built on a baseline that assumes, as is in current law, that features of TCJA expire. And he makes a number of proposals, but he hasn't offered a detailed plan for how he would meet his pledge to make sure that no family earning under $400,000 would see an increase of their taxes when that occurs. He has articulated principles that he would take into a negotiation. He's made clear he stands ready to work with Congress, and what the principles would be that no family making under $400,000 should see an increase in their taxes, because that is costly to implement relative to his budget. He will work with Congress to agree on a set of razors that would cover the cost of that.
So turning to free trade agreements, this administration has been interpreting the term free trade agreements so broadly that they've expanded it to include critical mineral agreements. Specifically, we saw the USTR brokered a CMA with Japan without any congressional approval for such a deal. So my next question, Secretary Yellen, as to why did the administration proceed in brokering this agreement without any input from Congress, which is required to do, and what plans are there in the future, as far as you're concerned, does the administration intend to take to ensure that Congress is notified of any FTA between the U.S. and any other country?
Well, certainly the administration agrees that Congress has an important role here. I think our objectives align in that our objective is to reduce our dependence on China and other foreign countries of concern, and to have more resilient supply chains by producing more at home and importing more from our partners and friends. And in that regard, especially when it comes to critical minerals that we're short of or lack, we're looking to expand sources of supply among our friends. We have consulted closely with Congress over the last year and a half, with leaderships and staff, members of this committee on these matters. Want to be sure that we're working with you and that our incentives are in alignment.
And lastly, Madam Secretary, I need to address China. I know it's been a topic of robust discussion today. China currently controls up to 50% of the electric vehicle battery supply chain, troubling to say the least. Your Treasury Department put out a rule this past December that defined battery component in a way that effectively favors Chinese manufacturers. Specifically under this rule, a foreign entity of concern can produce all materials and parts of the battery component and the electric vehicle can still remain eligible for a tax subsidy. I know this was raised earlier. So Madam Secretary, just lastly, can you please speak as to why the Treasury decided to define battery components this way? And can you explain what your department is doing to help U.S. manufacturers and not Chinese manufacturers?
I mean, I'd be glad to get back to you and try to understand better what you're focusing on here, but the FIAC rules are very strong and indicate that battery components starting this year made by a foreign entity of concern can't be included in any car that receives the $7,500 credit. Next year that expands to critical minerals and their processing.
I have follow-up with you, Madam Secretary. We will do that, but my time has expired. Mr. Chairman, I go back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Van Dyne.
Thank you very much. Secretary Yellen, earlier today you committed to closing the carried interest loophole. Unfortunately, this has become a popular punchline that is just not true. For a lot of new and emerging entrepreneurs across the country who don't come from Wall Street or wealthy backgrounds, carried interest is the sweat equity that they've put into their business. It's the work they've put into growing their business. And I look forward to working with my tax team colleagues to better educate members of Congress on the opportunity that carried interest provides and the long-standing tax policy principles that it's based on. Last year, you testified and said, quote, progress has been made on inflation, but there was still work to be done, unquote. Unfortunately, not much has changed in the last year. Inflation hasn't gotten any better. Energy prices haven't gotten any better. And we continue to see housing prices at record highs. Under this administration, prices have increased nearly 20%, and real wages have fallen by nearly 4%. That affects people who are making less than $400,000. And yet the president's budget put out earlier this year continued broke policies that exacerbate this problem. In your testimony, you claim the administration is taking actions to bring down the cost of key household expenses like energy, but that is not true. The Biden administration's desire to harm American energy continually through tax increases on domestic energy production is the weaponization of the tax code against all Americans, including those making less than $400,000. During your Senate Finance hearing, you said traditional energy companies have had significant tax benefits that tilted the scales. In the Treasury Green Book, the administration's tax proposal says, quote, these traditional oil, gas, and coal preferences encourage more investment in the fossil fuel section that would occur in a neutral system, and this market distortion is detrimental to long-term energy security. Do you really believe that oil and natural gas production is detrimental to the long-term energy security?
Well, to give preferences right now, when we
Or is she doing
understand
that through
the...
new policy deals, giving preferences, picking winners and losers?
Well, we pick winners and losers, but they have to be ones that are positive for what is an existential threat,
Okay,
which is
so you
climate
believe
change.
then that oil and gas, natural production, is an existential threat, and that will is somehow better to cut all of that production for our long-term energy security.
No one is saying to cut all that production,
So
but
some is
there's no we will be dependent on this for a long time, but there's no
Is it the
reason.
administration's goal to shut down energy companies and change the rules to basically make it impossible to operate profitably?
It is not, that is not the administration's objective, but there's no reason why we should be giving tax preferences.
But is tilting the
to
scales
incent.
toward green energy worth the security risk by buying oil from adversaries such as Venezuela?
We're promoting clean energy and renewables.
We are buying it from countries.
in order
We are
to-
buying it from countries that produce it in a much dirtier manner than any place in the U.S. And
We're
that is
going
what
to
your
switch to
policies are
renewables.
forcing us to do right now. Earlier, you talked about the corporate rate in the U.S. as my colleague Congressman Moore has alluded to. The U.S. has been at a quote race to the bottom. Did the Tax Cut and Jobs Act lower the corporate rate to the lowest in the OECD?
It's among the lower in the OECD.
I fail to see how this is the bottom then. I mean, under the president's budget, according to the Tax Foundation, the U.S. would have the second, not the lower to the bottom, but would have the second highest corporate rate in the world. Is this something that the Treasury is proud of?
Over decades, corporate tax rates
It
have
would be the
declined
second
around
highest
the world.
corporate rate in the world.
I don't believe that 21% is the second
I have other questions,
highest
but
in
I
the
also want to
world.
make
That's
sure that I have
certainly
some of
not
my other
true.
colleagues have an ability to ask them. And with my 1 minute left, I yield.
Madam Secretary, I know we're close to your time. I'd ask for your indulgence to our Democrat on the side over here, Mr. Byers from Virginia. Maybe Mr. Gomez, okay, from California.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Byer and I will be splitting this 5 minutes, so I'll be quick. We took care of Jimmy Panetta, so he couldn't get back in time, so we get the last 5. One of the things is, first, let me just say, I recognize that the President's budget proposal for fiscal year 2025 invests in working and middle-class families by making childcare and housing more affordable. And these are 2 issues that I don't think we give a lot of attention to. Last year, during a retreat with the Ways and Means Democrats, Jack Lew came by and said there's 2 issues that are, in the near and long term will be dragging down the growth of our GDP, childcare and housing. And it makes sense when you see almost those 2 issues combined eat up about 60% of a family's income pre-tax. So one of the things we're trying to do through 2 caucuses I started was the Congressional Dads Caucus is childcare, the child tax credit, how do we focus on that? And then at the same time, when it comes to more housing affordability. So I'm going to kind of go out of order since we have limited time on my questions, but Secretary Yellen, can you detail actions the administration is taking to provide desperately needed relief for America's renters?
We are really looking to expand through any number of tax proposals.
When it came to reducing child poverty in this country by making it fully refundable but also advanceable. I believe that refundable but also advanceable. I believe that advanceability is not given a lot of attention that it should get and should receive, because as a working class person, $200, $300, $500 a month means that you can use that for formula, diapers, all those monthly expenses. Would you agree that paying the CTC on a monthly basis, which I know that we can do, rather than yearly, would help maximize the CTC's power to help working families?
Yes, it would. I think it was very important, and the Internal Revenue Service worked very hard to make sure they implemented that right away. It was in the middle of the pandemic and it required an heroic effort, but it made a big difference and we're very supportive of it.
Thank you. With that, I'll yield the rest of my time to Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Gomez. Madam Secretary, I greatly appreciate seeing your proposal for a minimum income tax of 25% on the ultra wealthy. I was proud to work with Steve Cohen to turn this into legislation, many co-sponsors. It is ridiculous that the wealthiest 0.001% of Americans on average pay effective rates in the single digits. Many of them pay nothing. Can you talk to us about how that minimum tax would work?
Yes, the President's budget would impose a minimum tax of 25% on total income, and income would include unrealized capital gains. It would only apply to taxpayers with more than $100 million in wealth, and it would not require for those taxpayers who have highly illiquid assets, they could defer payment of it. Others could pay in installments so that it wouldn't be a huge hit in the first year. But right now, many wealthy people really never pay taxes on that during their lifetime. They borrow against it, live very well, and often can pass it on with step-up of basis at death so that no one ever pays taxes on those gains.
Thank you very much. One last question in 25 seconds. Are you thrilled with direct file so far?
It's going great. It's gone really well. We're going to provide a thorough assessment, but all the anecdotal evidence we hear, people have really appreciated it, found it easy to use. It saved them on average $270 and something like 12 hours of work to file their taxes, and it's a great option.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, this is your option. We have one member left. He can submit his questions. He'll give you those questions, or he can go now.
Go for it.
Thank you for your indulgence.
Last one.
Thank you, Secretary Yellen. I truly appreciate you being here and at least giving me some grace and giving me some time. Thank you very much. last week I sent you a letter on the decision by USTR to reverse digital trade policy at the WTO, which I'd like to submit for the record. With the decision, the USTR determined that it will no longer defend against foreign governments' demands for American businesses to locate facilities, equipment, employees, intellectual properties in those countries. In the Pillar 1 negotiations, market countries have sought taxing rights over companies selling into them, but those taxing rights are allocated on paper only, as we know. The local data storage requirements that would proliferate around the world do the opposite, reallocating taxing rights not on paper, but instead reallocating real economic assets that create a taxable presence in those countries. So this year's Green Book, the President notes the concern of undesired incentives to locate certain economic activities abroad. But if local data storage requirements are allowed to proliferate, U.S. businesses will face not only an incentive to invest abroad, but will be required to do so. This newly allowed method of discriminatory targeting of the U.S. companies for tax revenue is going to cost us obviously jobs and investment and IP transfers. So my question is, Secretary Yellen, did the Department of Treasury consult with USTR on the likely tax and economic impacts of this decision? I mean, did you guys work together? Did you talk about it at all?
Well, this was really USTR's decision, and I honestly have to defer to USTR when it comes to Ambassador Tai's position that she's taken on you're talking about the WTO situation with digital trade. When it comes to Pillar 1, we've had interagency coordination, and our position on this really remains completely unchanged. We're trying as hard as we can to get rid of digital service taxes that we regard as discriminatory against U.S. firms.
And thank you for that, but you know it very well. If you look at it, I mean, obviously our multinationals will have to build infrastructure, and that obviously will cost these companies jobs and cost taxes that could be paid here. I mean, how do we square that up?
You mean because of the WTO position?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I really just can't. I haven't been involved in that at all. We've generally opposed data localization requirements, and I don't think that's really changed significantly, but I honestly have to defer to USTR on that issue.
And I appreciate that. I mean, it just seems like everybody's at odds here. The USTR is at odds with the Treasury. I mean, I just, in the WTO, I mean, I don't quite, I think we're going in two opposite directions. And I think the thing that we don't want is where our multinationals are paying and paying taxes to other countries, and other countries are using us for a piggy bank. And I just feel like we're swaying that direction. Do you see that at all?
Well, we're really trying to oppose that in the Pillar 1 negotiations. We're trying to get rid of digital service taxes that are being imposed on our firms.
Well, I really appreciate that. I mean, but continue to look at that. Please do a deep dive into this, because what's going to happen is we're going to lose a lot of dollars when these infrastructures get moved to other countries, and losing jobs and IP transfers. So if you could. With that, I'll close down my comments. Thank you for being here.
Madam Secretary, we would not want you to leave here without getting high praise and accolades from the gentleman from California, because I'm sure that's what he wants to heap upon you on your way out. So, Mr. Panetta, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, I will be quick. I'll focus on just one issue, and it's one that's important to me and my constituent, the 19th Congressional District, and that's housing cost. As you know, researchers have found that high housing costs can strain a local economy by slowing employment growth. If housing is unaffordable, local companies can struggle to attract and recruit workers. I have long advocated, especially on this committee, for building of more workforce housing, for making sure that there's a first-time homebuyer's tax credit, for doubling the capital gains tax on home sales. We want to make sure that there is these types of tax credits to bolster housing. Can you explain how investment in housing, like the areas that I've talked about, can support the economy, and would the Department of Treasury support these types of investments, especially in workforce housing?
Well, we're very concerned about shortage of affordable housing in places like California, but also many parts of the country. The president is doing everything he can to promote affordable housing. There are many proposals in the Green Book, including expansion of LIHTC and credit for first-time buyers and sellers of houses to get rid of some of the lock-in that's occurred because of the increase in mortgage rates.
And I agree with you on the LIHTC, and I'm a big supporter of LIHTC. However, what I've found, especially in the 19th Congressional District, you have a number of people who work in our district, but they don't qualify for low-income housing. That's why I believe workforce housing is very, very important to ensure that people who work in the district can afford to live in the district. And so I'm hoping that workforce housing is something that the Department of Treasury would be interested in.
We'd be glad to work with you on that. We're trying to do everything we can in this area.
And I will take that as a closing answer. Thank you, Madam Secretary. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Madam Secretary, thank you for your time here before the committee, and thank you for extending your time. We stand adjourned. Without objection. Members will have 2 weeks to submit questions in writing. Madam Secretary, thank you.